Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Nightmare Narratives. I can picture some of you already in bed, maybe some of you just getting home from work. Wherever you are, whatever time it is, I'm glad you're here. If this helps you relax or sleep, please like and subscribe. It means a lot. Now let's get you comfortable, and I'll tell you tonight's story. My name is Benjamin Crowfeather, and I've been a ranger in these West Virginia mountains for 17 years. In that time, I've found 127 missing people alive. I know every trail, every cave, every old mine shaft in 200 square miles of the Monongahela National Forest. I believed in what I could track and touch until I heard the children singing in empty hills. It was October 1974 when everything changed. The autumn fog had rolled into Raven's Nest Hollow, thick as cotton, and the air carried that sharp bite that meant winter was coming early to the mountains. I was checking the old mining settlement one last time before the season turned nasty. Most folks avoided the place had for 50 years since the disaster. The hollow runs 8 miles deep into the mountains, steep walls rising on both sides like cupped hands. Back in the 20s, it was home to nearly 200 people working the coal mines. Then came March 15th, 1924. Cave-in killed 47 souls, 23 of them children who'd been playing near the mine entrance when the whole thing came down. Town packed up and left that very week. Now kudzu covered the old company houses, and acid from the mines had turned the creek the color of rust. The place felt wrong in a way that made your skin crawl. But I'd never seen anything there, except broken buildings and bad memories. That morning, the Kellerman family had driven up from Richmond for a reunion at the state park. Nice folks, 3 kids running around while the adults caught up over coffee and camp chairs. Tommy was 8, Susan was 7, and Michael had just turned 9. City kids who'd never seen mountains this wild. Around 2 in the afternoon, they vanished. Mrs. Kellerman found their sneakers lined up neat as you please at the edge of the campground, but the kids were nowhere to be seen. Park rangers called me in when the local search didn't turn up anything by dark. I arrived at dawn with my tracking gear and Buster, my bloodhound. 17 years doing this work, and I'd developed a system. Start where they were last seen, work outward in expanding circles, let the dog do what God made him for. But Buster wouldn't even sniff those shoes. The old dog whined and backed away like the sneakers were on fire. His ears went flat against his head, and he kept looking toward the tree line with this expression I'd never seen before. Fear, pure and simple. "What's wrong with him?" asked Alice Bramblewood, the young ranger assigned to help me. She was new, maybe 26, fresh from college, with a psychology degree and all kinds of ideas about search and rescue. "Nothing wrong with Buster," I said, kneeling to check the ground. "He's just telling us something we don't want to hear." The tracks were clear enough in the soft dirt. 3 sets of small footprints heading straight into the woods, not wandering like lost kids usually do, but walking with purpose. Walking toward Raven's Nest Hollow. That should have been my first warning. We followed the trail for 2 miles, Alice marking trees while I read the sign. The kids' tracks stayed together, never straying from a path that led straight toward the old mining settlement. That bothered me more than I let on. Lost children scatter. They get scared, they turn around, they double back. These 3 had walked like they knew exactly where they were going. The fog got thicker as we descended into the hollow. It seemed to rise up from the ground itself, carrying the smell of coal dust and something else, something sweet and wrong that made my throat itch. "Jesus," Alice whispered as we reached the first ruins. "How many people died here?" "Too many." I kept my eyes on the tracks, but they were getting harder to follow on the old gravel road. "Stay close and don't touch anything. Some of these buildings aren't safe." The mining company had left everything behind when they evacuated. Rusted equipment sat scattered between the houses like giant metal bones. The old tipple still stood at the mine entrance, a skeletal tower that creaked in the wind even though I couldn't feel any breeze. That's when we heard the laughter. High and clear, it came echoing up from somewhere deep in the mine shaft. Children playing, the sound bouncing off rock walls until it seemed to come from everywhere at once. Alice grabbed my arm. "That's them. They're down there." I held up a hand for quiet. The laughter stopped like someone had thrown a switch. In the silence that followed, I heard something that made the hair on my neck stand up. Footsteps, small ones, running on wooden floors that had rotted away decades ago. "Hello?" I called into the mine entrance. "Tommy? Susan? Michael?" My voice echoed back, changed, like it had picked up extra words on the way. It almost sounded like there were more names mixed in: Billy, Mary, Samuel. "Mr. Crowfeather," Alice said, pointing to the ground near the mine entrance. "Look at this." Fresh chalk marks covered the old concrete pad. Hopscotch squares, perfect and white like they'd been drawn that morning. But we hadn't seen any chalk in the kids' belongings. I knelt to touch one of the squares. The chalk came off on my fingers, real as anything, but when I looked up, Alice was staring at something over my shoulder. "Ben," she whispered, "turn around slowly." I did, and felt my breath catch. Someone had arranged the mining equipment, old carts, picks, shovels, into a perfect circle around us. Gear that had been scattered and rusted when we arrived now formed a ring maybe 20 feet across. The metal gleamed like it had been freshly oiled. "We need to go," Alice said. "Right now." But before we could move, we heard them again. Children's voices, singing an old song I remembered from my own childhood. "Ring around the rosy, pocket full of posies, ashes, ashes, we all fall down." The voices came from inside the mine, but also from behind us, and to our left and right. Surround sound in a place where nothing should be making noise at all. My flashlight flickered and dimmed. Alice's did the same. The compass on my belt started spinning like a roulette wheel. "This isn't electromagnetic interference," Alice said, backing toward me. "This is something else." That's when I saw the footprints. Mixed in with the kids' sneaker tracks were older Mark's boot prints from the 1,920 seconds, the kind mining families wore. Small boots. Children's boots. They were fresh as this morning's dew. We got out of that hollow fast, but I couldn't shake what we'd seen. Back at the ranger station, I pulled every record I could find on the 1,924 mining disaster. What I learned made my hands shake as I turned the pages. The mine collapse hadn't been an accident. A 7-year-old girl named Mary Fletcher had been playing near the entrance when she heard the support beams groaning. She'd run inside to warn the workers, and 3 other children, Billy Morrison and Samuel Kowalski, had followed her. The cave-in happened 2 minutes later. 47 dead, including those 4 children who died trying to save the adults. And now their names were being called in that empty mine. Alice and I went back the next morning with better equipment and back up 2 rangers from the next county and a volunteer fire chief who knew the mine system. The fog was thicker than ever, so heavy you could barely see 10 feet. Our radios crackled with static, and every flashlight beam seemed to get swallowed up before it reached anything solid. "Found something," called Ray Patterson, the fire chief. He was standing by the old company store, shining his light through a broken window. Inside, 3 sets of modern children's clothes were laid out on the counter: a superhero t-shirt, a blue dress, sneakers with cartoon characters. But they were arranged like mining uniforms. The t-shirt was folded next to a tiny hard hat that hadn't been there the day before. "Those are their clothes," Alice whispered. "But where are?" A hand touched her shoulder. She spun around, but nobody was there. Just empty air, and that thick fog swirling like it had been disturbed by something moving through it. "Something touched me," she said. "Small fingers, cold as ice." Ray was backing away from the store, his face white. "I heard my daughter's voice in there, but she's home in Charleston, 3 hours away." That's when the minecart started moving. The sound came from deep underground metal wheels on rusted tracks, squealing and clanking like a train was running through the mine. But the tracks had been pulled up for scrap metal in 1925. I grabbed Alice's hand. "We're leaving, now." As we headed up out of the hollow, I heard children calling our names. Not the lost kids us, our names, in voices too old and too sad for children to have. "Benjamin," came the whisper. "Benjamin Crowfeather. We know why you came here. We know about Sarah." I stopped dead. Nobody had mentioned Sarah. Nobody knew that my own daughter had gone missing in these mountains 11 years ago, when she was just 6 years old. We'd never found her body. "Don't listen," Alice said, pulling my arm. "Whatever this is, don't listen." But the voice followed us all the way to the road. "We kept her safe, Benjamin. We keep them all safe. Safe in the dark, where nothing can hurt them anymore." That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about Sarah, about the 3 missing kids, about children's voices singing in empty mines. Around midnight, I drove back to Raven's Nest Hollow. I shouldn't have gone alone. The fog was gone, and moonlight turned everything silver and sharp. I could see clear to the mine entrance from the road. What I saw there made me understand that we were dealing with something beyond any search and rescue manual. Children were playing in front of the mine. 4 of them, clear as daylight in the moon's glow. They were dressed in old-fashioned clothes overalls, button-up boots, cloth caps. They were playing hopscotch on those chalk squares that kept appearing. But when they moved, they cast no shadows. I watched for 10 minutes, and they never looked up. They just played their silent games over and over, like they were stuck in a loop from 50 years ago. Then, one of them, a little girl with pigtails, turned and looked right at me. She raised her hand and waved, and her smile was the saddest thing I'd ever seen. I knew her face. I'd been carrying her photo in my wallet for 11 years. It was Sarah. I came back at dawn with Alice and every piece of mining safety equipment I could gather. If my daughter was down in those mines, if those 3 kids were with her, then we were going in to get them out. "This is insane," Alice said as I strapped on a hard hat and safety harness. "We should call in the state police, the National Guard, and tell them what? That ghost children are holding living kids hostage in a mine that's been sealed for 50 years? I checked my emergency oxygen tank. They'd lock us both up. The mine entrance yawned like a mouth full of broken teeth. Our lights showed maybe 20 feet of tunnel before the darkness swallowed everything. The air smelled of coal dust and something else, something sweet and rotten that made my stomach turn. We'd gone maybe 50 yards when we found the first barrier. Someone had built a wall across the tunnel using old mining timber. But it wasn't blocking the way forward, it was blocking the way back. The entrance we'd just walked through was sealed solid with fresh cut boards. "Ben," Alice whispered, running her hands over the wood. "These boards aren't rotten, they're new." I turned my light ahead. The tunnel split into 3 directions, and I could hear movement in each one. Shuffling footsteps, whispered conversations, the scrape of metal on stone. "Tommy," I called. "Susan? Michael? Can you hear me?" A child's voice answered from the left tunnel, high and clear and familiar. "Daddy, is that really you?" Sarah. My little girl, lost for 11 years, calling to me from the dark. I started toward the sound, but Alice grabbed my arm. "Don't," she said. "Look at the walls." I swung my light up and nearly dropped the flashlight. The tunnel walls were covered in chalk drawings. Hundreds of them, layer upon layer, like a palimpsest of children's art. Stick figures holding hands, houses with smoke coming from chimneys, smiling faces with missing teeth. But the newest drawings showed something different. They showed 3 children, a boy and 2 girls, sitting in a circle while ghostly figures stood guard around them. And at the bottom, in careful letters, "We keep them safe." "They're protecting them," Alice whispered. "The ghost children, they think they're saving the living ones." That's when the mine foreman appeared. He stepped out of the left tunnel like he'd been waiting there all along. Tall and broad-shouldered, wearing the clothes of a 1,922nd mining supervisor. His hard hat was cracked down the middle, and something dark leaked from the crack down his face. "You shouldn't have come here," he said in a voice like grinding stone. "It's not safe above ground. Never been safe. That's why we keep them down here, where the mountain can protect them." "Where are the children?" I demanded, fighting to keep my voice steady. "Safe," he said. "Safe from cave-ins, safe from accidents, safe from the world that kills children." He gestured to the drawings on the walls. "These little ones understand. They know what happened to us. They know we're just trying to help." "Let them go," Alice said. "They don't belong here." The foreman turned his attention to her, and when he smiled, I could see through the hole in his skull to the darkness behind. "The young lady can stay too," he said. "Women died in that collapse. Mothers, daughters, wives. They'd like the company." The walls began to move. Not shifting or settling, moving like the mountain itself was breathing. The chalk drawings started to change, showing new pictures. Alice and me joining the circle of protected children, never growing old, never getting hurt, never leaving the safe darkness of the mine. "Choose quickly," the foreman said. "The mountain's patience isn't infinite." I looked at Alice, saw the terror in her eyes, and made a decision that would haunt me forever. "We understand," I said. "We understand you're trying to protect them. But there's something you need to know about the world up there. It's changed since 1924. It's safer now. The foreman's expression flickered. How? Mining safety laws, federal inspectors, equipment that can detect gas leaks and unstable supports before they collapse. I was making it up as I went, but there was enough truth in it to sound real. Children don't work in mines anymore. They have schools, playgrounds, places where they're protected by law. For a long moment, the only sound was water dripping somewhere in the darkness. Then, from deeper in the mine, I heard children talking. "Is he telling the truth, Mr. Colwright?" It was a boy's voice, young but somehow ancient. "Are children really safe up there now?" The foreman Colwright turned toward the sound. "Billy, you stay back. This doesn't concern." "It concerns all of us," said another voice. This one a girl. "We've been down here for 50 years, trying to keep others safe from what happened to us. But if the world's changed..." 3 small figures stepped into the light. Children in mining clothes, their faces pale as chalk dust. The little girl who'd waved at me the night before was with them, Sarah. But when she spoke, it wasn't with my daughter's voice. "I'm Mary Fletcher," she said. "This is Billy Morrison and Samuel Kowalski. We've been guarding this place since 1924, keeping children from the same fate that took us." She looked up at Colwright. "But maybe it's time to let go." Something. The mine foreman stared down at the children he'd been protecting for 5 decades. Something in his face cracked, and not just the wound in his skull. "If we let them go," he whispered, "what happens to us?" "Same thing that should have happened years ago," Mary said gently. "We rest." The walls stopped breathing. The darkness retreated. And from somewhere ahead, I heard living children crying, scared, confused, but very much alive. We found them in a natural cave behind the mine, wrapped in old mining blankets but unharmed. Tommy, Susan, and Michael had been there for 2 days, tended by children who brought them food and water and told them stories about the old days in Raven's Nest Hollow. "They were nice," Susan told us as we carried them toward the surface. "They said they were keeping us safe until our families could fix the dangerous world up there." Alice and I never talked about what we'd seen in that mine. The official report listed the incident as children trapped by unstable mine access, recovered safely after exposure to methane gas causing hallucinations in rescue personnel. But I know what really happened. The ghost children let them go because they finally understood that their long vigil was over. Children were safer in the world above than they'd been in 1924. Their sacrifice running into that mine to save the adults had meaning beyond their deaths. The mine entrances were permanently sealed a month later. The whole area was designated a historical site, with a memorial plaque listing the names of everyone who died in the 1924 disaster, including Mary Fletcher, Billy Morrison, Samuel Kowalski, and mine foreman Jeremiah Colwright. Alice transferred to a desk job in Charleston. She said she couldn't handle the woods anymore, kept hearing children's voices in empty places. Last I heard, she'd become an advocate for missing children, working with families like I used to be. As for me, I finished my career as a ranger, retired early, and now I give talks about mining safety history to school groups. I tell them about the brave children who died trying to save adults, about industrial accidents that changed safety laws, about the importance of protecting workers. I don't tell them about the voices I still hear sometimes when I drive past Raven's Nest Hollow. Voices singing old songs, fainter now but still there. Children's laughter echoing from empty hills. Sometimes, on foggy October nights, I see them playing in the ruins, but they're different now, not trapped, not guarding, just visiting. Checking on a place that was important to them, the way people visit old homes or childhood neighborhoods. I never saw Sarah again, because she was never really there, just my guilt and grief, wearing the face of the children who truly died protecting others. But sometimes I think I hear her voice mixed in with theirs, telling me I did good work, that I saved who I could save, that some mysteries are meant to stay buried with the dead who earned their rest. The Kellerman kids grew up normal and healthy. Last I heard, Michael was studying geology in college. He sent me a Christmas card a few years back with a note. "Thank you for finding us in the dark." If he only knew what found us first. These mountains are full of places where tragedy left its mark, where people died protecting others and never got properly honored for it. I've made it my business to know these places, to respect what happened there, to make sure the stories don't get lost. Because sometimes the dead just want to be remembered. And sometimes they want to know that their sacrifice meant something. But mostly, They want to know that the children are safe. The hollow is quiet now. The fog still rises from the valley on October mornings, but it doesn't feel wrong anymore. It feels peaceful. Like something that was broken has finally been put right. Like children who spent 50 years standing guard can finally go home. My name is Margaret Ironwolf, and I've been a park ranger in the Great Smoky Mountains for 14 years. I've seen just about everything these mountains can throw at you. Black bears getting into garbage, wild cats stalking hikers, even the occasional escaped exotic pet. My granddaddy used to tell stories about something else in these hills, something he called the beast. I always figured those were just tall tales to keep kids from wandering too far into the woods. I should have listened to those stories. It was August 1979, the worst drought year anyone could remember. The blackberry bushes on Blackberry Ridge had withered up to nothing, and every creek was running low. Animals were getting desperate for food and water, which meant more conflicts with the farming families that lived along the park border. That's where I came in. Livestock conflict resolution was my specialty. In 14 years, I'd handled 89 cases without a single human death. I was proud of that record. The call came in on a Tuesday morning from Jim Henderson, who ran cattle on a spread about 20 miles out from the nearest town. The only road to his place was a dirt track that wound through thick rhododendron groves and over rocky creek beds. Flash floods from the summer storms had washed out most of it, making the drive take over an hour in my old Park Service truck. Lost 3 head last night, Jim told me when I pulled up to his farmhouse. His hands were shaking as he lit a cigarette. Never seen anything like it, Margaret. 25 years raising cattle, and I never seen anything like what happened to those animals. Jim was a steady man, not given to dramatics. If he was spooked, there was good reason for it. I grabbed my equipment bag and followed him out to the pasture where his family had been grazing their small herd. The August sun was already brutal at 9 in the morning, and the air hung thick and still around us. The first thing I noticed was the silence. In all my years in these mountains, I'd never heard such complete quiet. No birds, no insects, not even the usual rustle of small animals in the underbrush. The rhododendron thickets that bordered the pasture seemed to lean in around us, their thick green leaves creating pools of shadow even in the bright morning light. "Over here," Jim called, his voice barely above a whisper. What I found didn't make sense. 3 cattle, all full-grown steers, had been killed sometime during the night. But the way they died, I'd seen bear kills, wildcat kills, even dog pack kills. This was different. The bite marks on their necks were massive, easily twice the size of what a black bear could make. And the precision of it bothered me. Most predators make a mess when they kill large prey. These animals had been taken down with surgical accuracy. I knelt beside the nearest carcass and pulled out my measuring tape. The bite radius was over 8 inches across. The largest black bear skull I'd ever measured topped out at 6 inches, and that was a record setter. Whatever made these marks had jaws bigger than any native predator in North America. "Jim, you hear anything last night? Any sounds at all?" He shook his head, taking another nervous drag on his cigarette. "That's what's got me spooked. Usually when something takes livestock, there's noise. Cattle bellow, predator growls, something. But it was dead quiet all night long. Mary couldn't sleep because of how quiet it was. I took photos of the bite marks and collected hair samples from what looked like claw marks on the nearest steer's hide. The hair was coarse and dark, longer than bear fur, but with an odd smell to it. Musky like bear scent, but with something else underneath. Something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. As I worked, I kept getting the feeling that something was watching us. Every time I looked up toward the rhododendron thickets, I thought I saw movement in the shadows. But when I focused on any particular spot, there was nothing there. Just the thick green leaves hanging motionless in the still air. "I'm going to set up some trail cameras," I told Jim as I finished collecting evidence. "Whatever did this might come back. Most predators return to a kill site." Jim nodded, but I could see the doubt in his eyes. We both knew this wasn't the work of any normal predator. But what else could it be? I'd built my reputation on finding rational explanations for wildlife behavior. There had to be a logical answer. I just didn't know then how much I was going to wish there wasn't. Dr. Samuel Wyndham arrived at my ranger station the next morning with a grim expression and a cooler full of tissue samples. Sam was the regional wildlife veterinarian, a man who'd spent 30 years studying predator behavior across the southeastern United States. If anyone could make sense of what had happened at the Henderson place, it would be him. "Margaret, I've run these samples through every test I can think of," he said, setting the cooler on my desk with a heavy thud. "The bite force calculations don't match any known North American species. We're looking at something that can generate over 1,200 pounds per square inches of pressure. That's more than a grizzly bear. And we don't have grizzlies in Tennessee." I poured us both coffee while Sam spread his findings across my desk. Photos of the bite marks, measurements, DNA analysis reports, all pointing to the same impossible conclusion. "Could be an escaped exotic," I suggested. "Rich folks up in Gatlinburg sometimes keep strange pets. Maybe something got loose." Sam shook his head. "Already checked. No permits for large carnivores in the region, no reports of escapes. Besides, look at this." He pointed to one of the photos, showing claw marks on a tree near the kill site. "See how high up these gouges are? Whatever made them was standing at least 8 feet tall, maybe 9. I studied the photo. The claw marks were deep and deliberate, carved into the bark of an old oak tree. But there was something else that caught my attention. The pattern of the marks. They weren't random slashes like you'd expect from an animal marking territory. They looked almost deliberate, purposeful. "We need to go back out there," I said. "Check the trail cameras, see if we caught anything." The drive to the Henderson place felt different this time. The rhododendron thickets seemed denser, the shadows deeper. Even with Sam riding along, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The silence that had bothered Jim was still there. No birds singing, no insects buzzing, just the low rumble of my truck engine and the crunch of gravel under the tires. Jim met us at the farm gate, his face pale. "Mary won't leave the house," he said. "Found more tracks this morning. Right up by the kitchen window. Whatever it is, it came looking around the house last night. The tracks were unlike anything I'd seen in 14 years of ranger work. They were huge, easily twice the size of a black bear print, but with one detail that made my blood run cold. There, clear as day, in the soft earth by Mary Henderson's kitchen window, was the print of what looked like an opposable thumb. "Bears don't have thumbs," Sam whispered. "No," I agreed. "They don't." We followed the trail of prints away from the house, toward the tree line where the Henderson property met the national forest. The tracks led us into a grove of ancient rhododendrons, their twisted branches forming a canopy so thick that noon felt like twilight beneath them. That's where we found the first trail camera. It was mounted on a sturdy oak, exactly where I'd left it the day before, but something had gotten to it. The camera housing was crushed like a tin can, the metal casing twisted and torn by what looked like massive claws. The memory card was gone. "Check the other cameras," I told Sam. But my voice sounded strange in the unnatural quiet of the grove. We found 5 more cameras, all destroyed, all in exactly the same way, crushed with methodical precision, memory cards removed. Whatever had done this wasn't acting on animal instinct. It was thinking, planning. As we stood there looking at the wreckage of our equipment, a sound drifted through the rhododendron grove that raised every hair on my body. It started low, like a bear's growl, but then it changed, rose higher, became something that sounded almost like a human voice calling out in pain. But underneath it all was something else. A wild, primitive sound that spoke to some ancient part of my brain that remembered when humans were prey. Sam grabbed my arm. "We need to leave, now." But as we turned to go back to the truck, we both saw it at the same time. About 50 yards away, moving through the rhododendron thickets with impossible quiet for something so large, was a shadow. Not a bear shadow, not any kind of animal shadow I'd ever seen. This shadow moved upright, on 2 legs, with a swaying gait that was almost human, but wrong in ways I couldn't put into words. It was watching us. Sam and I didn't run, but we walked faster than I'd ever walked in my life. Neither of us spoke until we reached the truck, and even then we sat in silence for a long moment, staring back at the tree line. "What do you think it was?" Sam finally asked. I started the engine and put the truck in gear. "I don't know, but I'm going to find out." As we drove away from the Henderson place, I caught a glimpse in my rearview mirror of something large and dark standing at the edge of the rhododendron grove. It stood perfectly still, watching our truck disappear down the washed-out dirt road. That night, I called my grandmother. Grandmama lived in a little house tucked back in a hollow about an hour south of Blackberry Ridge. She was Cherokee on her mother's side, and she knew stories about these mountains that went back longer than anyone cared to remember. I'd always loved visiting her as a child, sitting on her porch listening to tales about the old days when the Cherokee still lived free in these hills. "Granddaddy's beast stories," I said into the phone. "Tell me about them again." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. When Grandmama spoke, her voice was careful, measured. "Why you asking about Kekle Kudle, child?" The name sent a chill down my spine. I'd heard it before, in fragments of stories told on dark winter nights, but I'd never paid much attention. Something's killing livestock up on Blackberry Ridge. Something that doesn't match any known predator. Another silence. Then, "You best come see me tomorrow. And Margaret, don't go back to that ridge alone. Not until we talk." I hung up the phone, feeling more unsettled than before. Outside my cabin, the August night was still and hot, but I found myself checking the locks on my doors anyway. The call came at 3:17 a.m. I know because I was staring at the clock on my nightstand, unable to sleep, when the phone rang. It was Jim Henderson, and he was barely coherent. "It's here," he gasped into the phone. "It's right outside the house. Mary's hysterical. The cattle are going crazy." I could hear it in the background, the sound of terrified livestock and something else. That same impossible howl we'd heard in the rhododendron grove, but closer now. Much closer. "Jim, get your family into the bathroom in the center of the house," I told him. "Stay away from windows. I'm calling for backup and heading your way." I tried radioing for assistance, but the radio just gave back static. Phone lines to town were down too. Not unusual after the summer storms, but the timing felt wrong. I grabbed my rifle and flashlight and headed for my truck, knowing I was probably making a terrible mistake. The drive to the Henderson place took forever. Every shadow looked threatening, every sound made me jump. When I finally reached the farm gate, I could see lights blazing in every window of the farmhouse. The cattle in the near pasture were pressed against the fence farthest from the tree line, lowing in terror. I parked close to the house and ran for the front door. Jim let me in before I could knock, his face white with fear. "Where's your family?" I asked. "Upstairs bathroom, locked in." He pointed toward the ceiling. "Margaret, what is that thing?" Before I could answer, something hit the side of the house hard enough to rattle every window. Through the kitchen window, I caught a glimpse of movement. Something huge and dark circling the house with deliberate, measured steps. Another impact shook the house. This time, the kitchen window cracked. "It's testing the structure," I realized, looking for weak points. The thought chilled me. This wasn't random animal aggression. Whatever was out there was being systematic, intelligent. A third impact, harder than before, and the kitchen window exploded inward. Glass sprayed across the floor, and through the opening came a sound I'll never forget. A huffing, sniffing noise as something large investigated the hole it had created. I raised my rifle and aimed at the broken window, but what I saw there made me freeze. In the frame of the window, barely visible in the darkness outside, was an eye, not a bear's eye. Not any animal's eye I'd ever seen. This eye held intelligence, purpose, and it was looking directly at me. The eye blinked once, slowly, and then disappeared. "Jim," I whispered, "we need to get your family and get out of here. Now." But as we started toward the stairs, we heard it, the sound of wood splintering. The thing outside had found the back door. Jim and I ran for the staircase as heavy footsteps echoed through the first floor of the house. Behind us, I could hear furniture being overturned, walls being scraped by something with claws like railroad spikes. We reached the upstairs bathroom, where Mary Henderson sat on the floor, holding their 2 children, tears streaming down her face. The kids were maybe 8 and 10, old enough to understand they were in terrible danger, but too young to do anything about it. "Is there another way out?" I asked Jim. He shook his head. "Just the stairs." Below us, the footsteps had stopped. In the sudden silence, we could hear breathing, deep, measured breaths that seemed to shake the floorboards. Whatever was down there was thinking, planning its next move. Then came a sound that nearly stopped my heart, the deliberate, careful creak of something heavy climbing wooden stairs. I checked my rifle and counted my ammunition, 6 rounds. against something that could tear apart my trail cameras with its bare hands and punch through a farmhouse window like it was paper. The footsteps reached the top of the stairs and paused. In the silence that followed, I could smell it, that musky, wild scent I'd noticed at the kill site, but stronger now, much stronger. A shadow passed beneath the bathroom door. That's when Mary Henderson's youngest child started to cry. The crying stopped when I put my hand over little Sarah Henderson's mouth. Not to hurt her, but to keep us all alive. Outside the bathroom door, I could hear the thing moving around, testing the walls, learning the layout of the house. Then came the sound I'd been dreading, claws scratching deliberately against the bathroom door. Not trying to break in yet, just letting us know it knew exactly where we were. The window, Jim whispered, pointing to the small window above the bathtub. We could try to climb down. I looked. It was a 15-foot drop to hard ground. With 2 kids and Mary's bad knee, someone was going to get hurt. But it was better than waiting here to die. That's when the scratching stopped. In the silence that followed, I heard something that made my blood freeze. Footsteps moving away from the door, back down the hallway, back down the stairs. The thing was leaving. "Stay here," I whispered to the Henderson family. "Don't move, don't make a sound." I eased the bathroom door open and peered into the dark hallway. Empty. I could hear the creature moving around downstairs again, but differently now, more purposeful, like it was looking for something specific. I crept to the top of the stairs and listened. The sounds were coming from Jim's study, papers rustling, desk drawers being opened and closed. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't just a mindless predator, it was searching for something. Moving as quietly as I could, I made my way down the stairs with my rifle ready. The study door was open, and pale moonlight streaming through the window showed me something that nearly made me drop my gun. The creature was sitting at Jim's desk like a person, going through his papers with careful, deliberate movements. It was massive, easily 9 feet tall even sitting down, covered in dark fur that seemed to absorb the moonlight. Its hands were like nothing I'd ever seen, with fingers that ended in claws but moved with human dexterity. As I watched, frozen in terror, it found what it was looking for. A map. One of Jim's survey maps showing the property boundaries between his farm and the national forest. The creature studied the map for a long moment, then looked directly at me. I'll never forget those eyes. They held intelligence, yes, but also something like sadness and anger. Deep, ancient anger. When it spoke, I nearly fainted. "You disturbed sacred ground." The voice was like gravel and honey mixed together, words that seemed to come from deep in its chest. The ones who harvest the sacred root. They opened what should stay closed. My rifle was pointing at it, but I couldn't pull the trigger. This wasn't just some animal. This was something else entirely. "The ginseng poachers," I managed to whisper. "You're talking about the Jennings brothers." The creature nodded slowly. "They took from the burial cave, scattered the bones of my people. I am Kekle Kudle, guardian of the sacred places." I tried to warn them. They would not listen. I thought about the reports that had been filed last week. 2 men found dead near the old Cherokee burial sites up on the ridge. The official cause of death was listed as animal attack, but now I understood what had really happened. "You killed them." "I protected what they defiled." The creature stood up, its massive form filling the small study. "As I will protect it from all who disturb the rest of the dead." "The Hendersons haven't done anything wrong," I said, surprised by the steadiness of my own voice. "Their cattle just graze here. They don't even know about any burial sites." Kekle Kudle moved closer, and I caught the full force of its scent, wild and ancient, like earth and rain, and something indefinably older. "You are keeper of the mountain paths. You should have protected the sacred places." The accusation hit me like a physical blow. He was right. Those burial sites were supposed to be under Park Service protection, but I'd been so focused on managing wildlife conflicts that I'd never checked on them. I'd failed in my duty, and people had died because of it. "What do you want?" I asked. "The bones must be returned to their proper rest. The cave must be sealed, and those who know of this place must stay away." I nodded slowly. "I can make that happen. But you have to let the Henderson family go. They're innocent in this." Kekle Kudle studied me for a long moment, those ancient eyes seeming to weigh my soul. Finally, he moved aside, clearing the path to the stairs. "Go," he rumbled. "Take them away from this place. Do not return until the sacred ground is healed." I backed toward the stairs, keeping my rifle lowered but ready. As I reached the first step, the creature spoke again. Your grandmother's grandmother knew my people. She learned the old ways, the proper ceremonies. Ask her to teach you. Then he was gone, melting into the shadows as if he'd never been there at all. But the study window was open, and the night air carried that wild, ancient scent that I knew I'd never forget. It took 3 days to organize the ceremony. Grandmama came up from her hollow, bringing Joseph Sequoia, a Cherokee elder who knew the proper rites for reburying disturbed remains. The Park Service officially closed that section of Blackberry Ridge for archaeological preservation, and I made sure the paperwork would keep it closed permanently. We found the burial cave exactly where Kekle Kudle had said it would be, hidden behind a rockfall about 2 miles up from the Henderson place. The Jennings brothers had been thorough in their desecration, scattering bones and artifacts in their search for valuable ginseng roots. It took most of the day to collect everything and return it to its proper resting place. Joseph performed the ceremonies, while Grandmama and I assisted. We offered tobacco and said the prayers for the dead, asking forgiveness for the disturbance and promising to protect the site. As we worked, I kept feeling like we were being watched, but I never saw Kekle Kudle again. When the rituals were complete and the cave properly sealed, the silence that had hung over Blackberry Ridge finally broke. Birds began singing again. The normal sounds of forest life returned. Even the cattle in Jim Henderson's pastures seemed calmer. Dr. Sam Wyndham helped me write the official report. We listed the livestock deaths as predation by unknown large carnivore, possibly an escaped exotic animal. The case was filed under cultural sensitivity protocols and buried so deep in the bureaucracy that no one would ever think to look for it. The Henderson family moved to town shortly after. They sold their farm to the Park Service, which added it to the protected wilderness area. Mary Henderson still sends me Christmas cards, but she's never asked why we recommended they relocate. Some questions are better left unasked. I kept my job as a park ranger, but my focus shifted. I became the liaison between the Park Service and the Cherokee Nation, working to identify and protect other sacred sites throughout the mountains. It turns out there are more of them than anyone realized, hidden in remote hollows and forgotten caves. Sometimes, when I'm out on patrol in the deepest parts of the forest, I catch a whiff of that wild, ancient scent on the wind. Or I'll find tracks near a sacred site, massive prints with that unmistakable opposable thumb. But I've never tried to follow them. Some guardians are better left undisturbed. Grandmama taught me the old ways before she passed 2 years ago. I know the proper ceremonies now, the right offerings to make, the words to speak when asking permission to enter sacred ground. I've taught them to the newer rangers, though I don't tell them why these protocols are so important. Because the truth is, Kekle Kudle is still out there, still protecting the sacred places, still watching over the mountains that were once his people's home. And as long as we show proper respect, as long as we remember that some places are too sacred to disturb, he'll let us share these mountains in peace. But I've seen what happens to those who forget. The mountains have long memories, and their guardians are patient. They'll give you warnings first, strange tracks, destroyed equipment, cattle killed with impossible precision. Smart people listen to those warnings. The ones who don't, well, the official reports usually list them as animal attacks. And maybe that's true, in a way. After all, what is man but just another animal when he forgets how to respect the sacred? My name is Margaret Iron Wolf, and I've been keeping the peace between worlds for 20 years now. Some nights, when the wind is right and the moon is dark, I can hear him out there in the deep woods. Kekle Kudle, the guardian of sacred ground, and I sleep better knowing he's watching. My name is Thomas Nightshade, and I've been a forest ranger for 21 years. I thought I'd seen everything these Virginia mountains could throw at me until I met something that shouldn't exist. People always ask about my last name. Yeah, it's real. My great-grandfather was born with it, and we've carried it ever since. Seems fitting for someone who works in the dark corners of Jefferson National Forest, documenting old ghost stories and forgotten settlements. That's what I do besides the usual ranger stuff. I collect Appalachian folklore. Mountain people have been telling tales about spirits and haints for centuries, and I write them down before they disappear forever. Never believed a word of it, though. Just good stories to pass winter nights. 3 years ago, my wife Sarah died in a car accident on Route 58. Black ice, they said. One second she was driving home from her teaching job, the next she was gone. I threw myself into work after that. Easier to focus on old legends than deal with real loss. That's how I ended up in Witch's Hollow in November of 1988. The place sits in a narrow valley about 15 miles from the main road. You can only get there on foot, following an old deer trail that winds through thick woods. Most of the land around it is private property, posted with faded "no trespassing" signs that have been there since the 1962. But the hollow itself belongs to the Forest Service, and it's my job to keep an eye on it. The name comes from way back. In 1692, when the witch trials were happening up in Massachusetts, some families packed up and headed south. They wanted to get as far from that madness as possible. A few of them ended up here, drawn by the natural springs and the isolation. Later settlers weren't too happy about their neighbors' knowledge of herbs and healing, so the accusations followed them. Nothing as bad as Salem, but enough to give the place its name. I'd been documenting the old homesteads there for months. Stone foundations mostly, a few cabins still standing with strange symbols carved into the door frames, protection signs, according to local folklore. Stars and circles, twisted knots that hurt your eyes if you looked too long. The springs were the strangest part. 7 of them, spread throughout the hollow, each one crystal clear and cold as January. Mountain people always said the water could cure sickness or curse enemies, depending on who used it and how. I tested it once, perfectly normal H2O, nothing special about it at all. At least, that's what I thought. The problem started in late October. Hikers reported hearing crying coming from the abandoned cabins during rainstorms. Always a woman's voice, they said. Always heartbroken, sobbing that would stop the moment you got close enough to investigate. I figured it was wind through broken windows, or maybe an animal denned up somewhere. The mind plays tricks when you're alone in the woods. I'd heard plenty of strange sounds over the years that turned out to be perfectly normal once you tracked them down. Then people started finding wet clothes. Not just any clothes, old-fashioned dresses and aprons, soaking wet, hanging on bushes near the springs. They'd appear overnight, even when there hadn't been any rain. Nobody camping in the area, no washing machines for miles. Just wet laundry, dripping onto dry ground. That got my attention. Somebody was messing around in my hollow, and I meant to find out who. I brought my intern along on the first investigation. Sarah Moonbeam, yes, that's her real name. Her parents were hippies, was a folklore student from Virginia Tech. Smart girl, good with a camera, and she knew enough about Appalachian history to be useful. Plus, I figured an extra pair of eyes wouldn't hurt. We hiked in on a gray Tuesday morning. The trees were bare, except for a few stubborn oaks clinging to brown leaves. Fog hung low in the hollow, thick enough that you couldn't see more than 50 feet in any direction. Our boots crunched on frost-covered leaves, the sound echoing off the valley walls. Creepy place, Sarah said, adjusting her backpack. I can see why people made up stories about it. Every old settlement has ghost stories, I replied. Comes with the territory. But even as I said it, something felt wrong. 21 years in these woods, and I'd developed instincts about places. Some spots just felt heavy, like the air itself was holding its breath. Witch's Hollow had never felt like that before, but now it did. We found the first wet dress hanging from a blackberry bush near the largest spring. A brown wool thing with long sleeves and a high collar, cut in a style I'd seen in colonial museums. Water dripped from the hem, forming a dark puddle in the leaves below. Sarah reached for her camera. How long has this been here? No idea. Hikers found one like it last week, but I thought they were pulling my leg. I touched the fabric. Definitely wet and cold as ice. Feels real enough. Should we take it with us? I shook my head. Let's document everything first. Get photos from every angle, then we'll bag it for the office. While Sarah worked with the camera, I walked the perimeter of the spring. The water bubbled up from deep underground, so clear you could see every pebble on the bottom. But something was different about it now. A reddish tint that hadn't been there before, like rust, or I didn't want to think about what else it might be. That's when I heard the first sob. The sound came from somewhere behind me, soft and broken-hearted. I spun around, but saw only Sarah crouched by the spring with her camera. Did you hear that? I asked. She looked up. Hear what? The sobbing came again, closer this time. A woman's voice, full of grief, so deep it made my chest ache. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, echoing off the valley walls. Sarah heard it too. Her face went pale. What is that? Stay close, I said, pulling out my radio. Nothing but static. We were too deep in the hollow for a clear signal. Probably just someone hurt, maybe lost. But I didn't believe it. In 21 years, I'd heard every sound these mountains could make. This was something else. The crying led us deeper into the hollow, past 2 more springs, where we found more wet clothes, a white nightgown draped over a fallen log, a child's dress hanging from a low branch. All soaking wet, all old-fashioned, all impossible. Sarah stopped taking pictures after the 3rd one. This isn't natural, is it? I wanted to give her a rational explanation. Pranksters, maybe, or some kind of historical reenactment group. But the crying was getting louder, and my hands were starting to shake. We found the source near the old Matthews cabin. A woman knelt by the smallest spring, washing something in the red-tinted water. She wore a brown dress, like the one we'd found earlier, her dark hair covered by a white cap. Her shoulders shook with each sob, and she scrubbed whatever she held like her life depended on it. I couldn't see her face, but I could feel her sadness. It hit me like a physical weight, pressing down on my chest until I could barely breathe. All the grief I'd buried since my wife died came rushing back, mixed with something older and deeper. "Ma'am," I called out, "are you okay?" She looked up. I'll never forget that face. Not young, but not old either. Maybe 40, with kind eyes that had seen too much suffering. Her skin was pale as moonlight, and when she smiled at me, I felt like I was drowning. "You carry such pain," she said. Her voice was soft, with an accent I couldn't place. Old-fashioned, like the clothes. "Let me help you wash it away." She held up what she'd been scrubbing. A man's shirt, covered in dark stains that might have been blood. The water ran red around her hands. "We're forest rangers," Sarah said, her voice shaky. "We're here to help." The woman's smile grew sadder. Too late for help, but not too late for cleansing. That's when I noticed her feet weren't touching the ground. She floated just above the spring's surface, water dripping upward from her dress to rejoin the pool below. The air around her shimmered like heat waves, but it was November and barely 40 degrees. I grabbed Sarah's arm and backed away. "We need to leave. Now." The woman thing, whatever she was, didn't follow. She just kept washing that bloody shirt, humming a tune that sounded like a funeral hymn. But I could feel her watching us as we stumbled back through the woods. We didn't speak until we reached my truck. "What was that?" Sarah asked. "I don't know." I started the engine with shaking hands. Probably just someone playing dress-up. Mountain people can be strange about outsiders. But Sarah wasn't buying it any more than I was. She was floating, Thomas, and that water. Tricks of light. Bad angle. "We'll come back tomorrow with better equipment." I drove too fast on the winding mountain roads, desperate to put distance between us and whatever we'd seen. But I couldn't shake the memory of that woman's voice or the weight of sorrow she'd carried. That night, I dreamed about my wife. Not the good dreams, where she was still alive and we were still happy. This was the other kind. The dreams where she stood in our kitchen, dripping wet, asking why I hadn't saved her. Why I'd let her drive alone that night. Why I'd failed her when she needed me most. I woke up gasping, my sheets soaked with sweat. The next morning, Sarah called in sick. Her voice sounded strange over the phone, distant and hollow. "I keep thinking about yesterday," she said. "About that woman. What if she was trying to tell us something? Like what? What if someone really is hurt out there? What if we walked away from someone who needed help?" I wanted to tell her she was being ridiculous, but I'd been thinking the same thing. The rational part of my brain said we'd encountered a homeless person with mental problems, maybe a meth head having a bad trip. The rest of me kept remembering those kind, sad eyes. "Take the day off," I told Sarah. "We'll figure this out tomorrow." But tomorrow brought bigger problems. I was doing paperwork at the ranger station when the call came in. A search and rescue team needed help finding 2 missing hikers in the Jefferson National Forest. Last seen heading toward Witches Hollow 3 days ago. Their names were Jim and Kate Morrison, married couple from Richmond. Experienced hikers, good equipment, registered their route with Park Services. They should have been home Monday night. Instead, We found their car parked at the trailhead, covered with 3 days' worth of fallen leaves. I led the search team into the hollow that afternoon. 6 volunteers, all good people I'd worked with before. We brought everything: GPS units, flares, medical supplies, body bags. Just in case. The fog was thicker than usual, and the temperature had dropped 20 degrees since yesterday. Our breath misted in the air, and ice formed at the edges of the springs. We found Jim first. He was kneeling by the same spring where I'd seen the woman, scrubbing at a hiking jacket with bloody hands. His eyes were empty, unfocused, and he hummed the same funeral tune I'd heard before. When we called his name, he looked right through us. "Jim? Where's Kate?" I asked, but he just kept washing that jacket. "We found her at the 7th spring, the one locals called the Sorrow Pool. She floated face down in water so red it looked like wine. By the time we pulled her out, her lips were blue and her skin was ice cold. The paramedics said she'd drowned, but that was impossible. The spring wasn't even 3 feet deep." Jim spent 2 weeks in the psychiatric ward at Roanoke General Hospital. When he finally spoke, he told doctors about a woman who promised to wash away his guilt, said she'd been so kind, so understanding. All he had to do was help her with the laundry. The doctors called it a shared psychotic episode brought on by hypothermia and dehydration. I knew better. After the Morrisons, I should have closed Witch's Hollow to the public. Should have strung yellow tape across every trail and filed a report about hazardous conditions. Instead, I went back alone. I told myself it was about understanding what we were dealing with. Some kind of natural gas leak, maybe, or toxic mold causing hallucinations. There had to be a scientific explanation for what people were seeing and experiencing. But really, I went back because I couldn't stop thinking about that woman's voice. The way she'd looked at me with such understanding when she talked about pain. My wife had been dead 3 years, and I still woke up every morning feeling like I'd failed her. If there was even a chance that anything could wash that guilt away. I hiked in on a Thursday morning with a gas detector and water testing kit. The fog was so thick I could barely see my own feet, but I knew the way by heart. Past the broken foundation of the old Henderson place, around the hill where they'd found arrowheads back in the 70s, down into the valley where 7 springs fed a creek that had no name. The wet clothes were multiplying, dozens of them now, hanging from every tree and bush near the water. Dresses, shirts, children's clothes, all dripping wet and old-fashioned. They formed a maze of soggy fabric, forcing me to duck and weave my way through. At the center of it all, she waited. The morning woman, that's what I'd started calling her in my head, knelt by the largest spring with her washing. She looked exactly the same as before, but now I could see her more clearly. The way her hands moved in the water without making ripples, how her dress stayed wet but never dripped, the silver tears that rolled down her cheeks like liquid mercury. "You came back," she said without looking up. "I knew you would." "Who are you?" I asked. "Mercy Blackthorne." She held up a child's dress, examining it for stains only she could see. "Died in 1692, accused of witchcraft. They hanged me from the old oak by Miller's Creek." My gas detector showed normal readings. The water tested clean. Whatever was happening here, it wasn't chemical. "What do you want?" "To cleanse the guilt from tortured souls." She finally looked at me, and her eyes were full of impossible kindness. "You blame yourself for your wife's death. I can wash that pain away. She died in a car accident. There was nothing I could do. You fought the night she died, about money, about her working late again. Your last words to her were angry ones." Mercy's smile was heartbreakingly gentle. "I can see it all, Thomas. Every moment of regret, every sleepless night. Let me help you." She was right, and that terrified me. Sarah and I had fought that night. A stupid argument about her staying late to grade papers instead of coming home for dinner. I'd said things I didn't mean, things I'd regret forever. Her last memory of me was anger. How do you know that? The springs show me everything. Every soul who comes here carries guilt like a stain on their heart. The Morrisons felt guilty about something that happened to their daughter years ago. Sarah feels guilty about small lies she tells her parents. She gestured to the bloody shirt floating in the water beside her. You carry the heaviest burden of all. I recognized the shirt now. The blue one Sarah had worn to work the day she died. The one they'd cut off her in the emergency room. That's impossible. That shirt was buried with her. Guilt, creates its own reality. Your pain calls to these things, gives them form. Mercy stood, water streaming impossibly upward from her dress. But I can wash it all away. Every harsh word, every regret, every moment of blame. All you have to do is step into the water. Part of me wanted to do it. 3 years of carrying that weight, of waking up every morning and remembering how I'd failed the person I loved most. The idea of peace, of forgiveness, was almost overwhelming. But I thought about Jim Morrison, scrubbing at that jacket until his hands bled, about his wife floating in the sorrow pool. What happened to Kate Morrison? She found peace. Mercy's voice grew sad. Some guilt runs too deep for simple cleansing. For some, the only way to wash away sin is to join the water permanently. I backed away. You killed her. I tried to save her, but she couldn't let go of what she'd done to her little girl. The guilt consumed her, pulled her under. Mercy followed me, not walking so much as gliding. You're stronger. You could survive the cleansing. Stay away from me. Or what? You'll shoot me? She gestured to the service weapon on my hip. I've been dead for 300 years. What harm could you possibly do? She had a point, but I drew the gun anyway. It made me feel better, even if it was useless. I'm leaving, I said, and I'm closing this place down. Nobody else dies here. You can't close the springs. They've been here since before your people came to these mountains. They'll be here long after you're gone. Mercy stopped following, but her voice carried easily through the fog. But you can warn others. Tell them about the mourning woman. Tell them what happens to guilty souls who seek forgiveness in cursed water. Why would you want me to warn people away? Because not all who come here can be saved, and every soul that joins the springs makes the water hungrier. Her form was fading now, becoming translucent. Find another way to forgive yourself, Thomas Nightshade, before the guilt drowns you too. I ran then, crashing through the maze of wet clothes and stumbling up the trail like something was chasing me. Maybe something was. I could hear that funeral hymn echoing through the trees, growing louder with each step. By the time I reached my truck, I was gasping for air, and my hands were shaking so hard I could barely get the key in the ignition. I drove straight to the ranger station and called my supervisor. Told him we had a major safety issue at Witch's Hollow and needed to restrict public access immediately. He asked for details, but I couldn't give him any that made sense. How do you explain that a dead woman is washing bloody laundry in mystical springs? How do you write a report about supernatural guilt that drives people to suicide? Instead, I lied. Said there were unstable geological formations and toxic algae blooms in the water. Made up scientific-sounding explanations for why people were having psychological episodes. It was easier than the truth. The closure order went through that afternoon. Yellow tape and warning signs went up the next morning, but I knew it wouldn't be enough. Mercy Blackthorne had been washing guilt from tortured souls for 300 years. A few government signs wouldn't stop her, and I was starting to understand that she didn't want to be stopped. The real question was why she'd warned me away. What made my guilt different from the others? I thought about that as I drove home to my empty house, where my wife's coffee mug still sat in the sink and her side of the bed was still perfectly made. 3 years of living with ghosts, and now I'd finally met one that could talk back. That night, I dreamed about the springs again. But this time, I wasn't afraid. This time, I waded into the red water willingly, letting it wash over my head and into my lungs. The relief was instant and total. Every angry word I'd spoken, every moment I'd failed to be the husband Sarah deserved, all of it dissolved in that impossible current. When I woke up, my pillow was soaking wet. Sarah Moonbeam disappeared on a Friday. She'd been acting strange all week since we found the Morrison couple. Quiet, distracted, constantly checking her phone like she was waiting for some important message. When I asked if she was okay, she just smiled and said she was thinking about forgiveness. I should have seen the warning signs. Her roommate called Saturday morning. Sarah hadn't come home Friday night, and her car was missing. The last anyone had seen her, she was talking about visiting some historical site for her folklore project. I knew where she'd gone. I hiked into Witch's Hollow alone, carrying only my service weapon and a flashlight. The closure signs had been torn down, the yellow tape snapped and scattered. Someone had been through here recently, and I was pretty sure who. The fog was so thick I had to feel my way along the trail. My flashlight beam disappeared after a few feet, swallowed by the gray mist. but I could hear water running somewhere ahead, and that funeral hymn humming on the wind. I found Sarah at the sorrow pool. She knelt at the water's edge in her hiking clothes, scrubbing at something I couldn't see. Her movements were mechanical, repetitive, like she'd been doing it for hours. When I called her name, she didn't respond. "Sarah, we need to leave." "Can't leave," she said without looking up. "Not until it's clean." I moved closer and saw what she was washing, a baby blanket, tiny and pink, covered with dark stains. "Sarah, there's nothing there. You're washing empty water." "My sister's baby." Her voice was flat, emotionless. I was supposed to watch her while Mom went to the store, but I wanted to see my boyfriend instead. Left her alone for just 2 hours. She held up the invisible blanket, examining it. She crawled into the pool, drowned while I was making out behind the Dairy Queen. I'd never heard this story before, but something about it felt true. The kind of terrible secret people carry their whole lives. The guilt that shapes every decision they make. "That wasn't your fault. You were a kid. 15, old enough to know better." She went back to scrubbing. "But she can help me." The morning woman. She understands what it's like to lose someone you were supposed to protect. The temperature was dropping fast. Ice formed at the edges of the pool, and Sarah's breath misted in the air. But she didn't seem to notice the cold. "Where is she?" "Mercy." "Right here." The voice came from behind me. I turned to find the morning woman standing between the trees, more solid than I'd ever seen her. She looked almost human now, except for the way shadows seemed to gather around her feet and the silver tears that never stopped flowing. "You shouldn't have come," Mercy said. "I told you to find another way. Let Sarah go. She's not like the others." "No, she's exactly like the others. Guilt has hollowed her out, made her desperate for absolution." Mercy moved closer, her dress trailing water that froze as it hit the ground. "The child's death wasn't her fault, but that doesn't matter. She believes it was, and belief is all that matters here." I could see Sarah's lips turning blue, her movements getting slower. The pool around her was turning red, and I realized she wasn't washing an imaginary blanket anymore. She was washing her own blood from her hands where she'd scraped them raw against the rocky bottom. "Stop this. I'm not doing anything. The springs respond to guilt, not to me. I'm just the caretaker." Mercy's voice grew sad. "She came here seeking forgiveness, and the water is giving her what she asked for. By killing her? By cleansing her. Some stains go too deep for simple washing. For those souls, the only way to achieve purity is to join the water permanently." Sarah was starting to lean forward now, her head drooping toward the red surface. In a few more minutes, she'd slip under just like Kate Morrison. "There has to be another way." "There is." Mercy looked directly at me. "Trade yourself for her. Your guilt is older, deeper. The springs would be satisfied with that exchange." I thought about it. 3 years of carrying the weight of my failure, of waking up every morning and remembering that my last words to my wife had been angry ones. The idea of peace was tempting, but I looked at Sarah, young and broken and bleeding into cursed water, and I knew I couldn't let her die for my cowardice. What if there was a different kind of trade? "Explain." "You said you were hanged for witchcraft, that you died trying to protect others." I pulled out my gun, not to threaten but to show I was serious. What if someone acknowledged that injustice? What if someone officially cleared your name? Mercy's expression changed. For the first time since I'd met her, she looked surprised. "That's not possible. I died 300 years ago. There are no records, no courts that would hear such a case. You'd be surprised what we can do with historical research these days. The National Forest Service has connections with universities, genealogical societies, historical preservation groups. I was making it up as I went along, but it felt right. We could petition the Virginia legislature for a formal pardon. Posthumous exoneration for victims of witch trial persecution. Why would you do that? Because you're not the monster here. You're another victim." I understood it now, saw the whole picture. You died trying to save people who were falsely accused. The guilt you carry isn't about individual sins, it's about systematic injustice. You're trying to wash away a stain that was never yours to begin with. Mercy stared at me for a long moment. Then she began to cry, real tears this time, not the silver ones that had been falling for centuries. "I couldn't save them," she whispered. "Martha Prescott, Ann Wilkins, little Rebecca Hatch. I knew they were innocent, but I couldn't convince anyone to listen. They died because I failed to protect them. Just like I failed to protect my wife. Just like Sarah thinks she failed to protect her sister. I holstered my gun. We're all carrying guilt that belongs to someone else. You, for a justice system that valued fear over truth. Me, for a husband who should have said, "I'm sorry," instead of "goodbye." Sarah, for being a teenager who made a teenage mistake. Sarah had stopped scrubbing. Her head was still drooping toward the water, but she was listening. The difference is, I continued, yours was never your fault. You did everything you could. The guilt you've been carrying, the guilt that's been feeding these springs, it belongs to the people who ignored your warnings and killed innocent women. Mercy's form was growing brighter, more solid. You really believe that? I know it. And I promise you, if you let Sarah go, if you stop trying to cleanse guilt that isn't ours to begin with, I'll make sure the world knows what really happened here. I'll get you that pardon, that official acknowledgement. Your name will be cleared. And your own guilt? I thought about that. I'll carry it. But I'll carry it honestly, without trying to wash it away in magical springs. My wife and I had problems, real ones, and maybe some of them were my fault. But her death was an accident, not divine punishment for my failures. Learning to live with that truth, that's my job, not yours. Mercy looked at Sarah, still kneeling in the bloody water. Then she nodded. "Rise up, child," she said softly. "Your penance is complete." Sarah blinked, confused, like she was waking from a deep sleep. She looked around at the red water, at her bleeding hands, at me standing on the shore. "Thomas, what happened?" I was washing." She tried to stand and nearly fell. I waded in and pulled her to safety. "It's over," I said. "Time to go home." When I looked back, Mercy Blackthorn was gone. But the springs ran clear again, and the wet clothes had vanished from the trees. In the distance, I could hear church bells ringing. It took 18 months, but I kept my promise. The Virginia Historical Society was surprisingly receptive to the idea of posthumous pardons for witch trial victims. Turns out there was already a movement to acknowledge the injustices of colonial-era persecution, and Mercy Blackthorn's case fit perfectly into their research. We found records of her trial in the courthouse basement in Hampton. She'd been accused of consorting with devils, but the real crime was speaking out against the witch trials. She'd written letters to the governor, organized petitions, even tried to hide some of the accused women. For a woman in 1692, that kind of activism was essentially a death sentence. The pardon ceremony was held at the Virginia State Capitol on a crisp October morning. Governor Wilder himself signed the proclamation, officially clearing Mercy Blackthorn's name and acknowledging the state's responsibility for historical injustices. I was the only person there who knew she was listening. Sarah recovered, physically at least. The psychological scars took longer to heal. She spent 6 months in therapy, working through the guilt she'd carried since childhood. Her sister's death really had been an accident, a tragic case of a toddler wandering into a neighbor's pool while her teenage babysitter was distracted. The kind of thing that happens to good people in an imperfect world. She still works in folklore research, but she specializes in stories of healing and redemption now, instead of ghost tales. Says she's had enough of the dark stuff. As for me, I still carry the guilt about my wife's death. But I carry it differently now. Sarah and I had real problems that we never resolved, and some of those problems were my fault. I was working too much, drinking too much, pushing her away when she needed support. Our last fight was about more than just her staying late at work. It was about a marriage that was slowly falling apart. But her death was still an accident. Black ice and bad timing, not cosmic punishment for my failures as a husband. Learning to live with both truths, my real failings, and the randomness of tragedy has been the hardest thing I've ever done. I transferred out of Jefferson National Forest 6 months after the pardon ceremony. Couldn't keep working those mountains, knowing what I knew. But I made sure Witch's Hollow got the protection it deserved. It's a historical landmark now, with guided tours and educational programs about colonial-era persecution. The springs are clean and safe, just ordinary water bubbling up from underground. Sometimes visitors ask about the ghost stories, the legends of the mourning woman who washes away guilt. I tell them the truth, that some stories are too dangerous to believe. That real healing comes from facing your mistakes honestly, instead of looking for magical solutions. But late at night, when I'm lying in bed in my new house in Tennessee, I sometimes wonder if Mercy Blackthorn really found peace. if clearing her name was enough to break 3 centuries of trying to wash away guilt that was never hers to begin with. I like to think it was. I like to think she's finally resting, knowing that history remembers her as a defender of the innocent rather than a dangerous witch. But I also know that guilt is a powerful thing, and that some stains go deeper than names on government documents. There are other springs in these mountains, other hollow places where lost souls gather to wash their pain in waters that run red with regret. And sometimes, on foggy November mornings, when the air hangs heavy with unspoken sorrow, I still hear that funeral hymn echoing through the trees. The dead don't always stay buried, and not all ghosts are looking for revenge. Some are just looking for forgiveness they'll never find. My name is Daniel Blackstone, and for 16 years I've been tracking poison through the Coal River Valley. Not the kind that kills you quick, the kind that seeps slow through rock and soil, turning clear mountain streams the color of rust and making fish float belly up for miles downstream. I'm a park ranger, but most folks don't know we do more than just watch for campfires and bears. I've got a degree in environmental engineering, and my job is monitoring water quality in the New River Gorge. Specifically, I track acid mine drainage from the old strip mining operations that tore up these mountains back when coal was king, and nobody cared much about what happened after. March of 1981 was shaping up to be a bad month. Spring runoff was starting, and that meant all the contaminated water sitting in abandoned mine pits was going to flush down into the Coal River system. My truck was loaded with testing equipment, pH meters, sample bottles, chemical analysis kits. I'd driven this route so many times I could do it with my eyes closed, but every spring brought new surprises. Mining companies had a habit of leaving nasty gifts behind. The road to Monitoring Station 7 was already getting rough from the early melt. My Ford pickup bounced through potholes filled with orange water, iron oxide runoff that stained everything it touched. The CB radio crackled with static. Cell phones weren't a thing yet, and out here in the hollows, you were pretty much on your own. I parked at the wooden bridge that crossed Sulphur Creek, one of the worst contaminated tributaries. The water below ran bright orange, like someone had dumped a truckload of rust into it. Dead trees lined the banks, their bark bleached white where the acidic water had splashed during high flows. Nothing grew within 50 feet of the creek bed. It was like looking at a wound that wouldn't heal. But I'd seen worse. Hell, I'd been documenting worse for over a decade. What bothered me that morning wasn't the contamination, it was how quiet everything was. Usually you'd hear birds, wind through the trees, maybe a truck rumbling somewhere in the distance. That day, even the creek seemed to whisper instead of flow. I set up my equipment on the bridge and lowered the pH probe into the orange water. Normal readings for this spot ran between 2.5 and 3, about as acidic as vinegar. Today it was pushing 2.1. That was bad enough to eat through metal, let alone kill anything living. The temperature reading made me frown. 48 degrees. In early March, with snowmelt feeding the system, the water should have been closer to freezing. I double-checked the probe, thinking maybe ice had formed on the sensor, but the reading held steady. I was filling sample bottles when I heard something that made my skin crawl. From downstream, where the creek curved out of sight behind a stand of dead hemlocks, came what sounded like voices. Not words exactly, but the rise and fall of conversation carried on the wind. That didn't make sense. The nearest road was 3 miles away, and nobody had any business being down in that poisoned hollow. I stood still, listening. The sound came again, definitely human voices, but with a strange quality I couldn't place. Like people talking underwater. I packed up my gear and decided to investigate. Part of my job was keeping folks away from the worst contaminated areas. Some people still tried to fish these streams, not understanding that even touching the water could give you chemical burns. The creek bank was treacherous, covered in slick orange sediment that had the consistency of wet clay. I picked my way downstream, following a deer path that skirted the edge of the contaminated zone. The voices got clearer as I walked, but I still couldn't make out actual words. Then I saw them. 3 figures stood in the middle of Sulphur Creek, about 100 yards ahead. They were facing away from me, perfectly still in water that should have been eating through their boots. The orange contamination swirled around their legs like fog. I called out, "Hey, you folks need to get out of there right now, that water's dangerous." They didn't move, didn't even turn around. I started walking faster, pulling my radio from my belt. "This is Ranger Blackstone at Monitoring Station 7. I've got civilians in a contaminated waterway, requesting backup and possible medical assistance." Static answered me. The radio was dead. When I looked up, the figures were gone. I stood at the edge of the creek, staring at the empty water. There were no footprints on either bank, no sign anyone had been there. But I knew what I'd seen. 16 years of working alone in remote locations hadn't made me start seeing things. I waded into the creek, ignoring the way the acidic water immediately started eating at my rubber boots. The current was stronger than it looked, trying to pull me downstream toward the dead hemlocks. The bottom was soft, covered in decades of contaminated sediment that squished between my toes. That's when I felt it something smooth and hard under the muck. I reached down and pulled up a piece of metal, corroded green with age. It looked like part of a mining helmet, the kind they used back in the 50s and 60s. But that didn't make sense. This was strip mining country. The deep mines were 20 miles south. I was examining the helmet fragment when the water around my legs suddenly turned warm. Not just warm, hot enough to feel through my boots. The orange contamination began to swirl faster, forming patterns that looked almost like faces. I got out of there fast, scrambling up the bank and not stopping until I reached my truck. My hands were shaking as I loaded the equipment, and it wasn't from the cold. Back at the ranger station that evening, I logged the unusual temperature readings and filed a report about possible trespassers in the contaminated zone. But I didn't mention the voices, or the figures in the water, or the way the contamination had seemed to move with purpose. 16 years of tracking poison had taught me to trust my instruments more than my eyes. But that night, lying in my bunk and listening to the wind howl through the mountains, I couldn't shake the feeling that something else was tracking me. The next morning brought Jenny Riverside to my office. She was a hydrologist from the State Environmental Agency, young and eager, and still convinced that science could fix everything mining had broken in these mountains. I liked her optimism, even if I'd lost most of mine years ago. "Daniel, I need to talk to you about yesterday's readings from Station 7, she said, spreading water quality charts across my desk. "The numbers don't make sense." I leaned back in my chair, sipping coffee that was strong enough to wake the dead. "Which numbers?" "All of them. pH, temperature, dissolved metals, everything spiked at the exact same time. That doesn't happen naturally. Even in contaminated systems, you don't get synchronized changes across all parameters." She was right, and it bothered me more than I wanted to admit. I'd been thinking about those readings all night, along with everything else I'd seen at Sulphur Creek. "Equipment malfunction?" I suggested. I thought so too, until I checked the other stations. 7 sites showed similar spikes yesterday morning, all within a 20-minute window, all in the Coal River drainage. Jenny pulled out a topographical map and marked the affected locations with red ink. When she connected the dots, they formed a rough circle around the old Blackstone mine, the operation that had been shut down after the 1970 accident. 23 men died in that collapse, I said quietly. Bodies were never recovered. I know the history, Daniel, but we're talking about water chemistry, not ghost stories. Something's contaminating the system beyond normal acid mine drainage. I need to collect samples from the source. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the mountains where snow still clung to the north faces. The source is a flooded mine shaft half a mile into terrain that'll kill you if you make one wrong step. The whole area is unstable, contaminated, and officially off limits. Then I'll need a guide who knows the area. No. Daniel? I said no. I've seen what that place does to people. 3 researchers have tried to study the Blackstone site in the past 10 years. One fell into a mine shaft and broke his back. One got lost for 2 days and came out babbling about voices in the water. The third one just disappeared. Jenny looked at me like I was being unreasonable. She was probably right. But unreasonable had kept me alive in these mountains for 16 years. "Look," I said, turning back to her. "Give me 48 hours. Let me check the remote monitoring equipment, see if I can narrow down what's causing the anomalies. If I find something concrete, we'll talk about a site visit." She agreed reluctantly, and I watched her drive away in her state-issued sedan, wondering if I'd just condemned myself to another trip to Sulphur Creek. That afternoon, I loaded my truck with extra equipment backup, pH meters, a portable spectrometer, even an old Geiger counter I'd borrowed from the nuclear waste division. If something new was contaminating the system, I was going to document every trace of it. The drive to Station 7 felt different this time. The road seemed longer, darker, even though it was barely past noon. Clouds had moved in from the west, bringing the kind of gray overcast that made the mountains feel like they were closing in. I parked at the bridge and immediately noticed the smell sulfur mixed with something else, something organic and rotting. The orange water was flowing faster than it had yesterday, carrying foam that looked almost like soap bubbles. The temperature probe registered 52 degrees, 4 degrees warmer than yesterday, and the air temperature was only 38. Heat was coming from somewhere underground, and that meant either geothermal activity or something a lot worse. I was setting up the spectrometer when I heard the voices again. This time they were closer, and I could almost make out words. It sounded like singing a low, rhythmic chant that seemed to come from the water itself. I followed the sound downstream, past the dead hemlocks to where Sulphur Creek joined a larger tributary called Devil's Branch. The confluence was where the real contamination started. Devil's Branch ran clean and cold from the mountains, but the moment it mixed with Sulphur Creek, the water turned that characteristic orange and started eating everything in its path. Fish bones littered the banks, bleached white by the acid. That's where I saw him. A man in mining coveralls stood chest deep in the contaminated water where the two streams met. His back was to me, and he was completely motionless except for his mouth, which was moving in time with the chanting I'd been hearing. "Sir," I called out. "You need to get out of there immediately." He turned around. His face was wrong. Not just dead, that would have been bad enough. His skin was the same orange color as the contaminated water, and his eyes were solid white. When he opened his mouth, orange liquid poured out instead of words. I stumbled backward, grabbing for my radio. Static filled the channel, but underneath it I could hear more voices, dozens of them, all chanting in that same underwater rhythm. The thing in the water started walking toward me. With each step, the contamination around it grew darker, more concentrated. The orange foam on the surface began forming patterns, faces, hands, reaching shapes that dissolved and reformed. I ran. Behind me, the chanting grew louder. I could hear splashing, like multiple figures moving through the water. But I didn't look back. I made it to my truck and drove away fast, leaving half my equipment behind. At the ranger station, I tried to call Jenny, but she'd already left for the day. I sat in my office until well after dark, staring at the water quality charts and trying to convince myself I'd hallucinated everything. But the temperature readings were real, the chemical spikes were real, and somewhere in the back of my mind, a terrible thought was forming. What if the contamination wasn't just poisoning the water? What if something was poisoning the contamination? That night, I dreamed of orange faces rising from acidic streams and voices singing in languages that predated human words. When I woke up, my pillow was damp with water that smelled like sulfur and tasted like rust. Jenny was waiting in the parking lot when I arrived at work the next morning. Her state sedan was covered in mud, and she had that determined look that meant she'd already made a decision I wasn't going to like. "I went to Station 7 last night," she said without preamble. My blood turned cold. "What?" "After our conversation yesterday, I decided to do some preliminary sampling. Nothing too extensive, just enough to get baseline readings before we plan a proper survey." I grabbed her by the shoulders. "Tell me you didn't go near the water. Daniel, you're scaring me. Tell me you didn't go in the water. I collected samples from the bridge, just like you always do. But something strange happened." She pulled out her field notebook, pages wrinkled with moisture. My equipment started malfunctioning the moment I lowered it into the stream. Every meter I had went crazy, readings jumping all over the place, displays flickering on and off. I let go of her and walked toward the office, trying to keep my hands steady as I unlocked the door. Equipment problems happen. Acidic water plays hell with electronics. That's what I thought until I processed the samples. She followed me inside and spread lab results across my desk. The numbers made no sense. Heavy metal concentrations were off the charts, levels that should have been impossible in a natural system. But it was the organic compounds that made my throat dry. "Proteins," I said, reading the analysis sheet. "You found proteins in acid mine drainage. Human proteins. Blood proteins, specifically." We stared at each other across the desk. Jenny's face was pale, and I could see the first cracks forming in her scientific certainty. "There's more," she said quietly. "When I was packing up my equipment, I heard something downstream. It sounded like people." "What kind of people?" "People in distress, like they were calling for help." I sat down heavily in my chair. After 16 years of keeping this valley's secrets, the truth was finally demanding to be heard. "Jenny, I need you to listen to me very carefully. There are things about these mountains that don't make it into official reports. Things that would get us both laughed out of our jobs if we put them in writing." "What kind of things?" "The kind that explain why human proteins are showing up in water that's been dead for 30 years. I told her everything. The voices, the figures in the water, the man with orange skin and white eyes. By the time I finished, she was sitting on the edge of my desk, gripping her coffee cup like it was the only real thing in the room. "You're telling me there are ghosts in Sulphur Creek?" "I'm telling you there's something in that water that shouldn't exist, and it's getting stronger. Your readings prove it." "Daniel, this is insane." "Is it? You're a scientist. Look at the data. Synchronized chemical spikes across 7 monitoring stations. Temperature increases with no heat source. Human proteins in sterile acid water. What's your rational explanation?" Before she could answer, my radio crackled to life. "Ranger Station, this is Tom Morrison with Water Authority. We've got a situation at the Beckley treatment plant. You need to get down here right away." Tom Morrison had been treating water in the Coal River Basin for 25 years. If he was calling me directly instead of going through dispatch, something was seriously wrong. Jenny and I drove to the treatment plant in her sedan, following the winding road that paralleled the main stem of Coal River. The plant sat in a valley where 3 major tributaries converged, including Devil's Branch and Sulphur Creek. Tom met us at the gate, his usually calm demeanor replaced by barely controlled panic. "Started about 2 hours ago," he said, leading us toward the main building. "Every sensor in the intake system went red at the same time. We've never seen contamination levels like this." The control room looked like something from a disaster movie. Warning lights flashed across every panel, and technicians moved frantically between workstations, trying to isolate the source of the contamination. "Show them Tank 3, Tom said to one of his operators. The man led us to an observation window overlooking one of the settling tanks. The water inside was dark orange, almost red, and it was moving in ways that defied fluid dynamics. Currents spiraled and swirled without any mechanical agitation, forming patterns that looked disturbingly organic. "We've isolated the intake valves," the operator explained, "but the contamination is spreading through the system anyway. It's like the water itself is alive." Jenny pressed her face against the window. "What's that floating in there?" I looked where she was pointing and felt my stomach drop. Objects were rising to the surface of Tank 3, not debris or sediment, but shapes that looked like mining equipment. Hard hats, lunch pails, and what might have been part of a lamp assembly. 23 men died in the Blackstone mine collapse, I said quietly. Their bodies were never recovered. Tom looked at me sharply. "You think this is connected to the old mining accident?" "I think something's been building pressure in these watersheds for 30 years, and it's finally breaking through." As if responding to my words, the contaminated water in Tank 3 began to glow with a faint phosphorescent light. The spiral patterns intensified, and for just a moment, I could swear I saw faces forming in the orange liquid. "We need to evacuate the plant," I said. "Daniel, you can't be serious," Jenny protested. "This is a water treatment facility. There has to be a rational explanation." The lights went out. Emergency power kicked in after a few seconds, bathing the control room in red light. But in that moment of darkness, we all heard it voices singing in harmony, echoing up from the treatment tanks below. Tom was already moving toward the evacuation alarm. "Everyone out, full plant evacuation, move." As we filed out of the building, I caught Jenny's arm. "Do you still think this is about water chemistry?" She looked back at the treatment plant, where every window now glowed with that strange orange light, and shook her head. "What do we do?" she asked. I thought about 23 men who died in the dark, their bodies never properly buried, their spirits trapped in the poisoned water that filled their grave. I thought about contamination that followed its own rules and human proteins in sterile acid streams. "We find out what they want," I said, "and we give it to them before they take it anyway." The singing from the treatment plant grew louder, and I could see orange water beginning to seep from the building's foundation. Whatever had been building in the Coal River system for 30 years was finally free, and it was heading downstream toward communities that had no idea what was coming. Time was running out, and I was the only one who knew where this had all started. By sunset, the evacuation zone had spread to include 3 townships and the main water treatment facility for half of southern West Virginia. Emergency crews worked frantically to set up temporary water supplies, while EPA teams in hazmat suits tried to contain what they were calling unprecedented industrial contamination. But I knew better. This wasn't industrial contamination, it was something far older and angrier. Jenny and I sat in my truck at a roadblock 2 miles from the treatment plant, watching orange water flow down the mountainside in streams that followed no natural watershed. The contamination was spreading against gravity, climbing uphill through underground channels that shouldn't exist. The mine, I said, studying a topographical map by flashlight. It all goes back to the Blackstone mine. That's where we need to go. Daniel, that's insane. The whole area is flooded with contaminated water. Exactly. And if we don't stop this at the source, it's going to reach the Ohio River by morning. You want to explain to the EPA how human ghosts poison drinking water for 3 million people? Jenny stared at the orange glow emanating from the treatment plant. What makes you think we can stop it? Because they're trying to communicate. All this contamination, the equipment rising to the surface, the voices, they're not just randomly destroying things. They want something. What do they want? I thought about 23 men trapped in the dark for 30 years, their bodies never recovered, never properly buried. Recognition, respect, maybe just someone to finally come looking for them. We drove as close to the Blackstone site as the roadblocks would allow, then continued on foot through terrain that grew more treacherous with each step. The contaminated runoff had turned every stream and gully into a glowing orange tributary, and the air itself seemed thick with sulfur and something else, the smell of deep places that had been sealed too long. The entrance to the Blackstone mine was a jagged hole in the mountainside, surrounded by rusted equipment and warning signs that were older than I was. Orange water poured from the opening like a wound that wouldn't stop bleeding. The mine shaft goes down about 300 feet, I told Jenny as we approached the entrance. Most of it's been flooded since the accident, but there should be air pockets in the upper levels. Should be? Only one way to find out. We put on the diving gear I'd brought from the ranger station's emergency equipment cache. It wasn't much basic scuba tanks and masks, but it might give us enough time to reach whatever was at the bottom of this mystery. The water inside the mine was warm, almost hot, and it glowed with that same phosphorescent light I'd seen at the treatment plant. Visibility was maybe 6 feet in the contaminated liquid, but I could make out the shape of mining rails disappearing into the depths. We descended slowly, following the flooded tunnel deeper into the mountain. The water pressure increased with each foot, but so did something else, a sense of presence, like we were being watched by dozens of unseen eyes. 50 feet down, we started finding equipment. Mining helmets, tool belts, lunch boxes, all perfectly preserved in the acidic water that should have destroyed them decades ago. They were arranged in neat rows along the tunnel walls, like a museum display. At 100 feet, we found the first body. He sat in a mining cart, his coveralls and hard hat intact, his face turned toward the tunnel entrance as if he'd been waiting for someone to come looking. His skin had the same orange coloration I'd seen on the figure at Sulphur Creek, and his eyes were solid white. But he wasn't decomposed. After 30 years in contaminated water, he looked like he'd died yesterday. Jenny grabbed my arm and pointed deeper into the tunnel. More figures sat in mining carts, lined up like passengers on a train that would never reach the surface. 23 men, exactly as they'd been when the roof collapsed and the water rushed in. The tunnel opened into a larger chamber where the main shaft had been. This was where they'd been trapped, where they'd waited as the water rose and the air ran out. Emergency lights still functioned somehow, casting shifting shadows on the walls. And in the center of the chamber, carved into the rock face, was a message. "We are still here. We are still waiting." The words were surrounded by names, all 23 miners who had died in the collapse. Below each name was a date, and I realized with growing horror that they weren't death dates. They were the dates when each man's family had stopped coming to visit the mine memorial on the surface. The last visitors had been 5 years ago. Jenny pointed to her air gauge. We were already at half tanks. But before we could begin our ascent, the water around us began to glow brighter. The 23 figures in their mining carts turned their heads in perfect unison, looking directly at us. One of them raised his hand and pointed deeper into the mine. Against every instinct screaming at me to get out, I followed his gesture. At the back of the chamber, partially hidden by fallen timber, was another tunnel. But this one led up, not down. We swam through the opening and immediately felt the water pressure decrease. The tunnel angled sharply upward, and after 50 feet of swimming, our heads broke the surface into an air pocket that shouldn't have existed. We were in a natural cave that connected to the mine system. Emergency lights lined the walls, powered by some unknown source, and the air was breathable despite the sulfur smell. But what caught my attention wasn't the impossible preservation of the space, it was what hung on the cave walls. Photographs, hundreds of them, all showing the same thing. The memorial service for the lost miners that had been held every year until people stopped coming. Families aging and diminishing, flowers withering on the memorial stone, the gradual abandonment of memory. "They've been watching," Jenny whispered. "All these years, they've been watching people forget." A voice behind us made us both spin around. We tried to tell people we were still here. The man who spoke wore mining coveralls and carried a lunch pail, but his skin glowed with that same orange contamination. He was one of the 23, but somehow he was standing in the air pocket while his body remained in the flooded chamber below. "You poisoned the water system," I said. "You could have killed thousands of people." "We air the water system now," he replied. "Our blood, our bones, our voices, it all flows through these mountains. When people forgot about us, we had to make them remember. What do you want?" He gestured to the photographs on the cave walls. "What any dead man wants, to be properly buried, to be remembered, to finally rest." Jenny stepped forward. "How do we help you?" The miner's expression softened. "Bring people back to the memorial. Tell them we're still here, still part of these mountains. Let our families know where we are. And if we do that, then we can stop poisoning the water you need to live." The emergency lights flickered, and I knew our time was running out. The contamination would continue spreading until we could convince the outside world to honor the dead properly. We had a choice. Let the spirits of 23 miners destroy the water supply for millions of people, or find a way to give them what they'd been denied for 30 years: respect, remembrance, and finally, rest. 3 months later, I stood at the newly renovated memorial site overlooking the sealed entrance to the Blackstone mine. The ceremony was modest, but genuine family members who hadn't visited in years, local officials who'd finally listened to the truth, and a crowd of people who'd learned to respect the mountain's deeper secrets. The EPA report blamed the contamination event on previously unknown chemical interactions in legacy mining sites, which was technically true, if you didn't mind leaving out the part about human spirits bound to poisoned water. Jenny and I had agreed that some truths were too large for government forms. The real truth was written in the water quality readings that had returned to normal the day after our promise to restore the memorial. 23 names were carved in fresh granite, along with the inscription, "They remain part of these mountains, and these mountains remain part of them." Jenny transferred to a position with the Forest Service, specializing in the cultural preservation aspects of environmental restoration. She never talked publicly about what we'd experienced, but her new focus on honoring indigenous burial sites and historical mining areas spoke volumes about how the Coal River had changed her understanding of land management. I kept my ranger position, though my reports became more carefully worded. I still monitor water quality in the Coal River Basin, but now I also maintain the memorial site, ensuring that fresh flowers appear regularly and that visitors understand they're standing on sacred ground. The contamination hasn't returned, but the sensitivity has. My instruments still register temperature anomalies during the anniversary week of the mine collapse. Sometimes I hear voices in the water, not desperate or angry anymore, but peaceful, like people finally getting the rest they'd been denied. Last week, a mining company submitted permits to begin exploratory drilling in the Devil's Branch watershed. I've already started the paperwork to have the entire area designated as a historical preservation site. Some things are too important to be forgotten again. The Coal River runs clear now, supporting fish populations that haven't been seen in these mountains since before the mining started. But on certain nights, when the moon is dark and the air is still, the water glows with a faint phosphorescent light, not contamination, but something gentler. A reminder that the dead remain part of the land they died for, and that our responsibility to them doesn't end when the last shovel of dirt covers their graves. I've been a ranger for 20 years now, and I've learned that protecting wilderness means protecting more than just trees and wildlife. It means protecting memory, honoring the people who lived and died in these mountains, and understanding that some spirits can only rest when they know they haven't been forgotten. The water runs clean, but it remembers everything. And as long as I'm here to listen, the dead of Coal River will never have to poison the living again just to make their voices heard. Sometimes preservation isn't about stopping change. It's about ensuring that change includes respect for what came before. The Blackstone miners taught me that lesson in the most direct way possible. And every time I collect water samples from Sulphur Creek, I whisper their names to the flowing water, making sure they know someone is still listening, still remembering, still here. My name is Rebecca Thornbush, and I've been a park ranger for 19 years. People always ask me about the name. Yes, it's real, and yes, my parents had a sense of humor about it. But after what happened at Harvest Moon Gap in October 1975, I don't find it funny anymore. I work the Blue Ridge Parkway in North Carolina, specifically the remote sections where most folks never venture. My specialty is wildlife rehabilitation and nocturnal animal research. I've got veterinary training, and I know these mountains like the back of my hand. Every owl call, every deer trail, every predator that hunts after dark, I've documented them all. Or so I thought. The research station sits 30 miles from the nearest settlement, perched on a ridge overlooking what locals call Harvest Moon Gap. It's beautiful country, mixed hardwood forest with limestone caves scattered through the hillsides. The Cherokee used to consider this area sacred, full of burial mounds and old hunting grounds. White settlers who came later whispered stories about things that weren't quite human roaming these ridges. I never paid much attention to the folklore. Science was my religion, and I had work to do. October came early that year, the leaves turning brilliant orange and red by the first week. The harvest moon was set to peak on the 15th, and I planned to use the extra light for my nocturnal predator study. I'd set up motion-triggered cameras along the natural hunting corridors, the game trails where deer moved between feeding and bedding areas. My research assistant that season was Mark Wolfbane, a graduate student from the State University. Another one of those names that seemed too perfect to be real, but Mark was good people. 24 years old, eager to learn, and not afraid of spending weeks in the wilderness with just radio contact to the outside world. "You really think we'll get anything interesting on these cameras?" Mark asked as we checked the battery levels on our equipment. He was tall and lean, with dark hair and intense brown eyes that seemed to catch every movement in the forest. "Depends what you call interesting," I said, adjusting the camera angle to cover a well-worn deer path. Last year I documented a black bear teaching her cubs to fish in Whisper Creek. Year before that, I caught footage of a mountain lion that wasn't supposed to exist this far east. Mark grinned. "Maybe we'll get lucky and film Bigfoot." I laughed, but something in his tone made me glance at him twice. There was an odd expression on his face, like he was testing me somehow. "Stick to real animals, kid," I said. "They're plenty mysterious, without inventing new ones." The first week went smoothly. We established our routine, check cameras during the day, review footage in the evening, maintain equipment, and take notes. The research station was comfortable enough, with solar panels for basic electricity and a wood stove for heat. We had enough supplies for a month, plus emergency rations and a radio for weekly check-ins with headquarters. But something felt different about the forest that October. The usual animal sounds seemed muted, and the deer moved in tighter groups than normal. Even the birds acted nervous, taking flight at shadows that shouldn't have startled them. "Notice how quiet it's been at night?" Mark asked one evening as we reviewed the day's footage. "Usually you hear coyotes around this time." I nodded, though I'd been trying not to think about it. In 19 years of wilderness work, I'd learned to trust my instincts. When the forest went quiet, there was usually a reason. "Could be anything," I said. "Weather change, food source disruption, new predator moving through the area." "New predator?" I shrugged. "Mountain lions are making a comeback. Maybe one's claimed this territory." But I knew it wasn't a mountain lion. The silence was too complete, too unnatural. Even apex predators didn't shut down an entire ecosystem like this. That night, as wind rattled the station's windows and October cold crept through the walls, I lay awake listening to nothing. No owl calls, no rustling leaves from small mammals foraging, no distant coyote songs. Just silence, deep and waiting. And somewhere in that silence, I could have sworn I heard footsteps circling our station. Not the random wandering of deer or the purposeful tread of bears, but something else. Something that walked on two legs and stopped every few minutes, as if it was studying us. When morning came, I found tracks in the soft earth around our building. They looked almost human, except for the size and the strange, elongated shape of the toes. I measured them carefully and took photographs, but I didn't mention them to Mark. Not yet. I'd been documenting nocturnal predators for years, but these tracks suggested I was about to encounter something that didn't fit in any field guide. Something that might be documenting us right back. The footage showed up on camera 3, positioned along the eastern deer trail, where the forest opened into a small meadow. I was reviewing the night's recordings when I saw it, a dark shape moving through the frame at 2:17 a.m. "Mark, come look at this," I called, rewinding the clip. He leaned over my shoulder as the infrared footage played. The shape moved differently than any animal I'd studied. It was tall, maybe 6.5 feet, and it walked upright but with a strange, loping gait. The body looked human from a distance, but something was wrong with the proportions. "What do you think it is?" Mark asked. His voice sounded strange, almost excited. "Could be a person," I said, though I didn't believe it. "Poacher, maybe. But look at how it moves." The figure paused in the center of the frame and turned toward the camera. For just a moment, two eyes reflected the infrared light like mirrors. Then it was gone, disappearing into the tree line faster than any human could move. "Those eyes," Mark whispered. "Did you see how they glowed?" I rewound the footage again, studying the creature's face. The features were wrong, too angular, with what looked like an extended jaw. And those eyes were positioned too wide, like a predator's. "We need to move this camera," I said. "Get a better angle on that trail. Or we could set up there in person," Mark suggested. "Tonight. See what comes back." I stared at him. "Are you out of your mind? We don't know what that thing is." "Exactly. That's why we need to study it." There was something in his tone that bothered me, an eagerness that seemed out of proportion to scientific curiosity. But he was right about one thing: we needed more information. That afternoon, we hiked out to relocate the camera. The forest felt even quieter than before, and I noticed Mark kept sniffing the air like he was tracking something by smell. "You coming down with something?" I asked. "No. Why?" "You keep." "Never mind." We found the spot where the creature had paused. The ground was soft from recent rain, and I could make out partial prints in the mud. They were definitely not human, too long, with claw marks at the tips. "Beck," Mark said from a few yards away, "look at this." He was kneeling beside a large oak tree, pointing at deep scratches in the bark about 8 feet off the ground. The marks looked like claw gouges, but they were too high and too large for any animal I knew. "Territory marking," I said, though the words felt hollow. "Some kind of bear, maybe." "Bears don't scratch that high," Mark said. "And look at the spacing. Those claws are huge." I photographed the marks and took measurements, but my hands were shaking. In 19 years of wildlife work, I'd never seen anything like this. The scratches were fresh, made within the last day or two. As we worked, I became aware of a smell, musky and wild, like wet dog mixed with something else. Something that reminded me of the large predator exhibits at the zoo. "We should head back," I said as shadows began lengthening through the trees. "Already? We just got here." "Mark, look around. Do you see any other animals? Hear any birds? This whole area is dead quiet because something big and dangerous is living here." He looked disappointed, but he helped me finish setting up the new camera position. As we packed our gear, I noticed him glancing back at the claw marks repeatedly. The walk back to the station felt longer than usual. Every shadow seemed to hide a watching presence, and I found myself checking over my shoulder constantly. Mark, on the other hand, seemed energized. He moved through the forest with new confidence, like he belonged here in a way I didn't. That night, I locked the station doors for the first time since arriving. Mark noticed but didn't comment. We ate dinner in relative silence, both of us jumpy at every sound outside. Around 11 p.m., the howling started. It wasn't like any wolf call I'd ever heard. The sound was too deep, too intelligent, and it seemed to come from multiple directions at once. The howls would start low and mournful, then rise to an almost human scream before cutting off abruptly. "Coyotes?" Mark suggested, but his voice was tight with tension. "No," I said, "definitely not coyotes." The howling continued for almost an hour, sometimes close enough to rattle the windows, sometimes distant and echoing through the mountains. I tried to count the different voices and stopped at 7. Whatever was out there, we were surrounded. When silence finally returned, it was somehow worse than the noise. I sat by the radio, considering whether to call for backup, but what would I say? That we'd filmed something unusual and heard some howling? Headquarters would think I'd been in the wilderness too long. Around 2 a.m., something large walked across our roof. The footsteps were deliberate and heavy, moving from one end of the building to the other. Then they stopped directly over our sleeping area and stayed there for several minutes. Mark grabbed my arm. "It's testing us," he whispered, seeing how we react. "How do you know that?" I can feel it. It's intelligent. It's hunting us." The footsteps resumed, circling the building's perimeter at roof level. Whatever was up there had incredible balance and agility. When it finally left, jumping from the roof to the ground with a heavy thud, I could hear it moving through the underbrush for several minutes before silence returned. "We're leaving tomorrow," I said. "We can't," Mark replied. "Not yet. We're on the verge of discovering something incredible. We're on the verge of becoming something's dinner." Mark was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "What if they're not trying to hurt us? What if they're just curious?" "They? You heard the howling. There's a pack of them. A family, maybe." I stared at him in the darkness. "A family of what, Mark?" "I don't know yet," he said, "but I think they want us to find out." The way he said it, with such certainty and strange anticipation, sent ice water through my veins. Because for the first time, I realized that Mark might not be on my side anymore. Something was happening to him, something that had started the moment we arrived at Harvest Moon Gap, and I was beginning to suspect it was already too late to stop it. The next morning, Mark's appetite had doubled. I watched him devour 6 eggs, half a pound of bacon, and 4 pieces of toast like he hadn't eaten in days. When I commented on it, he just shrugged and said the mountain air was making him hungry. But it wasn't just the appetite. His movements were different, more fluid and predatory, and his eyes seemed brighter somehow, more alert to every sound and scent around us. "Let's check yesterday's footage," I said, trying to keep my voice normal. The new camera position had captured something that made my blood freeze. The creature from before wasn't alone. 3 of them moved through the frame between midnight and 3 a.m., and they weren't randomly wandering. They were coordinating, using hand signals, and positioning themselves like a hunting party. "Look at that," Mark said, pointing at the screen. "They're communicating. They have language." I watched the largest figure gesture toward our research station, clearly visible in the distance. The other 2 nodded, an unmistakably human gesture, and spread out in different directions. "They were planning something," I whispered. "Or discussing something," Mark corrected. "Maybe deciding whether we're threats." "Mark, these things are stalking us. We need to leave. Now." He turned to face me, and for just a moment, his eyes reflected the light like an animal's. "We can't leave yet, Beck. I need to understand what they are." "What you are?" The words slipped out before I could stop them. Mark went very still. "What's that supposed to mean?" I studied his face, looking for the graduate student I'd known for 3 weeks. He was still there, but something else was emerging, something that made my ranger instincts scream danger. "You've been changing since we got here," I said carefully. "The appetite, the way you move, how you seem to know things about these creatures." "I don't know what you're talking about," but his denial came too quickly, and when he turned away, I saw him sniff the air again, that strange, animal behavior I'd been noticing. I excused myself and stepped outside to think. The forest was still unnaturally quiet, but now I noticed other things. Branches broken at shoulder height, as if large creatures had passed through. Strange scratches on tree trunks. And everywhere, that musky scent that reminded me of wild predators. When I came back inside, Mark was standing over our supply cabinet, holding my emergency flare gun. "Just checking our safety equipment," he said, but he didn't put it back. That afternoon, I convinced him to help me pack our essential gear. If these things decided to attack the station, I wanted to be ready to run. Mark seemed reluctant, but he helped load our backpacks with food, water, and survival equipment. As evening approached, the temperature dropped and wind began howling through the trees. Mark became increasingly agitated, pacing around the station and pausing frequently to listen to sounds I couldn't hear. "Storm coming," he said, though the sky had been clear all day. "How can you tell?" "I can smell it. Feel it in the air pressure." I checked our weather radio, but there were no storm warnings. Yet something was definitely building. I could sense it too, though not with Mark's apparent certainty. Around sunset, we heard voices in the distance. They were human voices, calling back and forth through the forest. Male voices, speaking words I couldn't quite make out. For a moment, I felt relief. Other people meant safety, rescue, normal explanations for everything we'd experienced. "Hello," I called out the window. "We're over here." Mark grabbed my arm so hard it hurt. "Don't," he hissed. "Those aren't people." "What are you talking about?" "I can hear them." "Listen closer." I did, and my relief died. The voices were wrong somehow. The words sounded human, but the rhythm and tone were off, like someone imitating human speech without quite understanding it. And underneath the familiar words, I could hear something else, low growls and what sounded like sniffing. "They're using our language," Mark whispered, "trying to lure us out." "How do you know that?" He looked at me with those bright, strange eyes. "Because I'm starting to understand theirs." The fake human voices continued for another hour, sometimes close enough to seem right outside our door, sometimes distant and echoing. They called our names. Somehow they knew our names, and pleaded for help with injuries and being lost. But Mark was right. No human voice carried that undertone of predatory hunger. As full darkness fell, the voices stopped and the real howling began. Tonight it was different, more organized, more purposeful. The pack was bigger too. I counted at least 10 distinct voices, all calling to each other in complex patterns that sounded almost like language. "They're getting ready," Mark said. He was standing by the window, silhouetted against the darkness outside. "Ready for what?" "The hunt. It's almost time." "Time for what, Mark?" He turned to face me, and in the dim light from our solar lantern, I saw that his face had changed. His jaw was more pronounced, his teeth looked sharper, and his eyes held an intelligence that was no longer entirely human. "The harvest moon," he said. "Tomorrow night, that's when they hunt." "Who hunts?" "We do." The word "we" hung between us like a death sentence. Because I finally understood what was happening to Mark, and why these creatures had been circling us for days. They hadn't been planning to kill us. They'd been planning to recruit us. And with Mark, they were succeeding. Outside, the howling reached a crescendo that shook the station's walls. Through the window, I could see shapes moving between the trees, tall, angular figures that walked upright but moved with animal grace. They were waiting for tomorrow night's full moon, waiting for Mark's transformation to complete. And then, they would come for me. I looked at Mark, standing by the window like he was already one of them, and realized I had less than 24 hours to figure out how to survive what my research partner was becoming. The Harvest Moon Hunters had found their newest member. Now they were coming to collect their prize. By morning, Mark's transformation had accelerated beyond any possibility of denial. I woke to find him crouched by the window, perfectly motionless, watching the forest with predatory intensity. His hair had grown noticeably longer overnight, and when he turned to look at me, I saw that his canine teeth had elongated into unmistakable fangs. "They're beautiful," he said, gesturing toward the tree line where several tall figures stood watching our station. "Once you understand what they are." I could see them clearly now in the morning light, 7 creatures that looked almost human but wrong in fundamental ways. Their limbs were too long, their faces too angular, their movements too fluid. They stood without moving for hours, simply watching and waiting. "What are they, Mark?" "Mountain people," he said. "The original inhabitants. They never left. They just adapted." "Adapted to what?" "Hunting humans." His voice carried no shame or horror, just matter-of-fact acceptance. "We encroached on their territory, so they learned to hunt us. But they're not monsters, Beck. They're family." I backed toward our equipment cache, moving slowly so as not to trigger whatever predatory instincts Mark was developing. "How long have you known?" "Since the first night. I could smell them on the wind, hear their calls in the howling. Something inside me recognized them." He smiled, and his new fangs caught the light. "Something inside me wanted to join them." "This is impossible." People don't just transform into what? What word are you looking for, Beck? Werewolves, I whispered. Mark laughed, a sound that carried an odd harmonic, like a howl disguised as human amusement. Not werewolves, something older. Something that was human once, but chose to become something better. Through the window, I watched the creatures begin moving closer to our station. They moved with pack coordination, spreading out to surround the building while maintaining careful distances from each other. They're going to kill me, I said. No, Mark replied. They're going to offer you the same choice they offered me. Join the family or leave the territory forever. And if I refuse both options? Mark's expression darkened. Then you become prey. I grabbed my backpack and the flare gun, backing toward the rear door of the station. Mark made no move to stop me, but he tilted his head like he was listening to something. They can track you anywhere in these mountains, he said. Running will just make it more interesting for them. What would you do, Mark? If you were still human, what would you tell me to do? For just a moment, something flickered in his eyes, a trace of the graduate student I'd known. Silver, he whispered. They're afraid of silver, and they can't cross running water under moonlight. Then the moment passed, and his expression hardened again. But that won't help you tonight. Tonight is the harvest moon, and I'll be hunting with them. I bolted for the back door. The forest exploded into motion around me. I could hear the pack communicating in their strange howling language, coordinating the hunt as I crashed through the underbrush. My ranger training kicked in, and I used every trick I knew, doubling back on my trail, moving through streams to break my scent, climbing rocks to avoid leaving footprints. But they were better. I could hear them moving parallel to my course, staying just out of sight but close enough to let me know they were there. They were herding me, I realized, pushing me away from the main trails and towards some destination of their choosing. As the sun began setting, I found myself at the edge of Whisper Creek, the same stream where I'd filmed bears fishing the year before. The water ran fast and clear over limestone rocks, heading down toward the valley. Behind me, howling filled the forest as the creatures called to each other in the gathering darkness. I could see shapes moving between the trees, and one of them was definitely Mark. He moved differently now. His gait had become the same loping stride I'd seen on the camera footage. The harvest moon rose huge and orange above the mountain peaks, casting everything in an eerie light. As its rays touched the creatures in the forest, I saw their final transformation begin. Their human features melted away, replaced by elongated skulls and powerful jaws filled with predatory teeth. Their hands became clawed, their spines curved into hunting postures. Mark emerged from the trees at the edge of the clearing, no longer recognizably human. He was beautiful in a terrible way, perfectly adapted for killing, graceful and deadly and utterly alien. "Last chance, Beck," he called, his voice now carrying harmonics that made my bones ache. "Join us, or run forever." I looked at the creature that had been my research assistant, then at the pack spreading out behind him. 7 apex predators, each one capable of tracking and killing humans with supernatural efficiency. But I was a park ranger with 19 years of wilderness experience. I'd studied predators my entire career, and I knew their weaknesses as well as their strengths. "I'll take option 3, I said, raising the flare gun. The red flare burst against Mark's chest in a shower of sparks and burning chemicals. He screamed, a sound no human throat could make, and stumbled backward. The other creatures howled in response, but they didn't cross the stream. Running water under moonlight, Mark's last human gift to me. I waded into Whisper Creek and began moving downstream, keeping to the center where the current ran strongest. Behind me, the pack followed along the banks, but they couldn't cross. They howled their frustration into the harvest moon. But they were bound by rules older than human memory. I stayed in that creek for 8 miles, until it joined the main river and I could see the lights of the ranger station downstream. By then, the howling had faded to distant echoes in the mountains. 3 days later, search teams found the research station empty but undamaged. The camera equipment was gone, all footage erased. The official report listed Mark Wolfbane as missing, presumed lost in the wilderness. But I know better. The Harvest Moon Hunters had gained a new member, and the mountains of North Carolina had claimed another soul. I transferred out of the Blue Ridge District 2 weeks later. Officially, it was due to stress from losing a research partner in the wilderness. Unofficially, I couldn't face those mountains, knowing what hunted in their shadows. My replacement lasted 6 months before requesting a transfer to desk duty. The one after that made it 3 months. Now they rotate rangers through Harvest Moon Gap on short assignments, and none of them stay overnight during full moons. The official explanation is budget constraints. I've spent the last year working coastal preserves in South Carolina, documenting shorebird migration patterns and sea turtle nesting sites. Clean, simple wildlife that doesn't challenge the boundaries between human and animal. But I still wake up sometimes, hearing howls that sound almost like voices calling my name. The silver cross I wear now was blessed by 3 different ministers and a Cherokee medicine man. I don't know if it would actually protect me, but it helps me sleep at night. The running water rule seems to be real. I've tested it by camping near streams during full moons, and the presence I sometimes feel never crosses moving water. I tried to research the history of Harvest Moon Gap, but the records are frustratingly incomplete. Cherokee oral traditions mention shape-shifting hunters who guarded the mountain burial grounds. Colonial-era documents reference entire families disappearing near the gap, leaving only tracks like men, but not men. Even recent reports show a pattern of missing hikers during lunar peaks, though the Park Service attributes these to normal wilderness hazards. Nobody wants to acknowledge what's really happening up there. Last month, I received a postcard with no return address. The picture showed Harvest Moon Gap in autumn, and the handwritten message said, "The family is growing. We miss you. M." The handwriting looked like Mark's, but it was addressed to Rebecca Thornbush, and no one outside the mountains had ever called me by my full surname. They remember me. They're still watching, still waiting for me to return. Sometimes, in the darkest hours before dawn, I wonder what would have happened if I'd made a different choice. If I'd accepted their offer and let the transformation take me the way it took Mark, would I have found peace in becoming something other than human? Would the constant fear and vigilance finally end? But then I remember Mark's face in those final moments, beautiful and terrible and completely inhuman. Whatever he became, it wasn't the graduate student I'd known. The Harvest Moon hunters don't offer transformation, they offer replacement. I keep my transfer requests updated and never work assignments longer than 6 months. When you've seen what hunts in the deep wilderness, staying in one place too long feels like tempting fate. The mountains of North Carolina are vast and beautiful, full of wildlife and natural wonders that inspire awe in millions of visitors each year. Rangers like me work hard to preserve that wilderness and keep people safe from its natural dangers. But there are some dangers we can't protect people from. Some dangers we can't even acknowledge exist. Next month is October again, and the harvest moon is rising. Somewhere in the Blue Ridge Mountains, a pack of hunters is preparing for another season. They're patient, these creatures. They've learned to wait decades for the right prey, the right circumstances, the right opportunity to expand their family. And they never forget a potential member who got away. My name is Rebecca Thornbush, and I've been running from the Harvest Moon Hunters for exactly 1 year. I have a feeling my running days are almost over. My name is Michael Darkwood, and I've been a ranger on the Appalachian Trail for 12 years. Before that, I worked as an EMT for 6 years. I've seen broken bones, heart attacks, snake bites, and hikers who got lost for days. I thought I'd seen everything the mountains could throw at people. I was wrong. The section I patrol covers 30 miles of trail through central Pennsylvania. Most of it's normal hiking terrain, rocky paths, dense forest, creek crossings, but there's one spot that's different. We call it the Screaming Tunnel. It's an old railroad tunnel that goes straight through Pine Ridge Mountain. Built back in the 1922. It's about half a mile long and carved right through solid rock. The trail runs through it now, but no trains have used those rusty tracks for over 60 years. Hikers love it. They think it's cool to walk through this dark tunnel in the middle of nowhere. Most of them don't know why the train stopped coming. On July 14, 1926, a passenger train derailed inside that tunnel. 67 people died. The mountain walls trapped the steam and smoke. People couldn't breathe. They couldn't escape. The screaming echoed for hours before rescue crews could reach them. After that accident, 3 more trains derailed in the same spot over the next 2 years. Nobody could figure out why. The railroad company finally gave up and abandoned the tunnel. The state turned it into part of the hiking trail in 1965. I've walked through that tunnel hundreds of times. It's perfectly safe now. The trail surface is smooth and well maintained. We put emergency lights every 100 feet. There are call boxes at both ends that connect to our ranger station. But I always feel uneasy in there. The air is different. Even on hot summer days, it's cold inside the tunnel. Your voice echoes strangely. Sometimes you hear sounds that don't make sense, like water dripping when the tunnel is bone dry, or wind moving when there's no wind. The bats don't help. Thousands of them hang from the ceiling. During the day, they're quiet, but their presence makes the darkness feel alive and watching. Other rangers joke about it. They say the screaming tunnel is haunted. They tell hikers ghost stories about phantom trains and passenger screams. Most people laugh it off. I never found it funny. My partner Lisa Stonepath and I were doing our regular Monday morning patrol on July 15th, 1987. It was already hot at 8 a.m., and the weather report predicted thunderstorms later. Summer storms in the mountains can be dangerous. Lightning strikes, flash floods, hikers getting lost in the rain and fog. We needed to check the tunnel and make sure the emergency equipment was working properly. A group of college kids had come through over the weekend and reported some of the lights were flickering. "You ever wonder what really happened in there?" Lisa asked as we hiked toward the tunnel entrance. She'd been a ranger for 3 years, but she still got nervous about the tunnel. Train derailed. People died. End of story, I said. I didn't like thinking about it too much. But why did it keep happening? 4 different trains, 4 different engineers. All of them crashed in the exact same spot. I didn't have an answer for that. Nobody did. The tunnel entrance looked normal that morning. Dark mouth in the mountainside, framed by old stone blocks. The trail disappeared into blackness after about 50 feet. Our footsteps echoed as we walked in. The first emergency light was working fine. So was the second. We were halfway through the tunnel when Lisa stopped. "Do you hear that?" I listened. Water dripping, our breathing, the soft sound of bats moving overhead. Hear what? Like a rumbling sound, really faint. I held my breath and listened harder. Nothing. Probably just trucks on the highway. Sound carries weird in here. But there was no highway close enough for us to hear trucks. We checked the rest of the lights and both call boxes. Everything was working. We were walking back toward the entrance when I heard it too. A low rumbling sound, coming from deeper in the tunnel. It sounded like a train. "There's no train," I told myself out loud. My voice echoed strangely in the darkness. The rumbling got louder. It definitely sounded like a locomotive getting closer. Heavy metal wheels on railroad tracks, the steam engine chugging. Lisa grabbed my arm. "Mike, we need to get out of here." We started walking faster toward the exit. The sound was growing louder behind us. I could hear other noises now. People talking, laughing, the sounds you'd hear on a passenger train. But that was impossible. No train had used these tracks in over 60 years. The rails were covered with rust and dirt. Tree branches hung down into the tunnel from cracks in the ceiling. "Run," I said. We ran toward the tunnel entrance, our flashlight beams bouncing wildly on the stone walls. The train sounds were getting closer. I could hear the whistle now, long, mournful blasts that echoed through the tunnel like screams. We burst out into the sunlight and kept running for another 100 yards before stopping to catch our breath. When we turned around, the tunnel was silent. "What the hell was that?" Lisa gasped. I didn't know. I pulled out my radio and called the other rangers. "This is Mike. Has anyone reported train activity near Pine Ridge?" "Negative," came the reply. "No active rail lines within 50 miles of your position." Lisa and I walked back to the tunnel entrance. We stood there for 10 minutes, listening. Nothing. Just the normal forest sounds, birds, wind in the trees, a creek running nearby. "Maybe it was an earthquake," I said. "Underground rumbling. That sounded like a train whistle, Mike." She was right. But there had to be a logical explanation. There always was. We reported the incident when we got back to the ranger station. Our supervisor, Bill Harrison, had been working these mountains for 25 years. He just nodded when we told him what happened. "Acoustic anomalies," he said. "That tunnel creates weird sound effects. Highway noise, aircraft, construction equipment, It all gets amplified and distorted in there. Happens all the time. That made sense. Old railroad tunnels were known for strange acoustics, but it bothered me all week. On Wednesday, a family of hikers reported hearing train noises in the tunnel. On Friday, a group of teenagers said they heard people screaming inside. By Saturday, 3 different hiking groups had called our emergency line about strange sounds in the screaming tunnel. "We should close it," Lisa said, "at least until we figure out what's causing this." "Close it with what justification?" Bill asked. "Funny noises? The trail is structurally sound. The emergency equipment works fine. We can't close a major trail section because of acoustic anomalies." He was right, but I still didn't like it. Sunday morning started with a call from a hiker named Dave Martinez. He and his girlfriend had camped near the tunnel Saturday night. Around midnight, they heard a train crash. It was loud, he told me over the radio, like metal screaming and people yelling for help. It went on for maybe 20 minutes. We were too scared to go check it out. I drove up to their campsite. Dave and his girlfriend Sarah looked exhausted, like they hadn't slept at all. "It definitely came from the tunnel," Sarah said. "We could hear the echo. People were screaming for help, and there was this horrible metal grinding sound." Dave nodded, "like a train derailing and cars piling up, then people crying and calling for their families." I walked over to the tunnel entrance. The trail showed no signs of disturbance, no broken glass, no metal debris, no evidence that anything had happened. The emergency lights were all working. I called the state police and local fire department. Nobody had received any emergency calls. No reports of train accidents anywhere in the region. "You want me to walk through and check?" Lisa asked. She'd driven up to help with the investigation. "We'll do it together," I said. We entered the tunnel at 2 p.m. on July 19th, 1987. The emergency lights cast pale circles of light every 100 feet. Between them, our flashlights created moving shadows on the tunnel walls. Everything looked normal. Rusty railroad tracks, stone walls, dirt and leaves on the trail surface. The bats were quiet overhead. We were 3/4 of the way through when we heard the voices. People talking, laughing, having conversations. It sounded like a crowded train car, multiple conversations happening at once. A child asking their mother when they'd arrive at their destination. An elderly man complaining about the heat. I stopped walking. "Lisa, do you hear that?" Her face was white in the flashlight beam. "Those are people talking." The voices were coming from all around us, but there was nobody there. Just empty tunnel and abandoned railroad tracks. Then we heard the whistle. Long, loud, and so close it seemed to come from right behind us. We spun around, flashlights cutting through the darkness. Nothing. The rumbling started. Heavy wheels on metal tracks, the sound of a locomotive under full power, getting louder by the second. "It's coming right at us," Lisa whispered. But we could see the tracks. They were empty, rusted, overgrown with weeds. Nothing was moving on them. The train sounds got louder and louder. I could hear the steam engine laboring, the cars rattling, people laughing and talking inside. The whistle blew again, so loud it hurt my ears. Then the brakes started screaming. The sound of brakes screaming on metal wheels filled the tunnel. It was deafening, like standing next to a real train trying to stop, but we still couldn't see anything. Lisa and I pressed against the tunnel wall, flashlights shaking in our hands. The train sounds were right on top of us now. I could feel wind rushing past, but the air in the tunnel wasn't moving. Then came the crash. The sound of metal tearing apart, cars derailing and piling up. It lasted forever, screeching, grinding, the horrible noise of a train destroying itself. And underneath it all, people screaming. Men, women, children. Screaming in terror and pain, calling for help, crying out names of family members. The sounds echoed through the tunnel like it was really happening right in front of us. I grabbed Lisa's hand and we ran toward the nearest exit. The screaming followed us. It seemed to come from the walls themselves, from above, from below. People trapped and dying and begging for someone to save them. We made it outside and kept running until the sounds faded away. When we turned back, the tunnel was silent again. "That wasn't acoustic anomalies," Lisa said. She was shaking. I radioed Bill and told him what happened. He drove up immediately with 2 other rangers. All 4 of us went into the tunnel together. Nothing. No sounds, no evidence of any disturbance. Just an empty, abandoned tunnel with rusted railroad tracks. "You probably heard construction equipment," Bill said. "There's a highway project about 10 miles south of here. Heavy machinery can create echoes that travel for miles underground." But we all knew that wasn't true. That night, I went to the library and researched the train accident. I found newspaper reports from 1926 describing the derailment in detail. The passenger train was traveling from Pittsburgh to Harrisburg. It entered the tunnel at normal speed around 8 p.m. on July 14th. Something went wrong in the deepest part of the tunnel. The locomotive brakes locked up and the train derailed, with cars piling up behind the engine. The tunnel walls trapped the steam and smoke. 67 passengers died from the crash, burns, or suffocation. It took rescue crews 6 hours to reach the wreckage because the tunnel was blocked. The newspaper quoted survivors describing horrible screaming that echoed for hours and the sound of people calling for help when there was nothing anyone could do. Over the next 2 years, 3 more trains derailed in the exact same spot. Different engineers, different times of day, different weather conditions. The investigation found no mechanical problems with the tracks or signals. The railroad company finally gave up and abandoned the line. I drove back to the tunnel that night around 8 p.m. I wanted to test a theory. I parked at the trail entrance and walked to the tunnel mouth. At exactly 8:03 p.m., the sound started. A train whistle in the distance. Then the rumbling of wheels on tracks, getting closer. People talking and laughing inside the passenger cars. A child asking questions. An old man complaining about the heat. I checked my watch. The train sounds lasted exactly 18 minutes. Then came the screaming brakes, the crash, the terrible sounds of people dying. That went on for about 20 minutes before fading to silence. The timing matched the newspaper reports exactly. I called Lisa and told her what I'd discovered. It happens every night at the same time. The sound of the original accident. Number 14. "That's impossible," she said. "I know, but I think we need to close the tunnel." Bill wouldn't hear of it. "You want me to tell the State Park Service that we're closing a major trail section because of ghost trains? I'd lose my job. Then what do we do? Ignore it. Don't respond to reports about strange noises. Tell hikers it's acoustic phenomena and leave it at that." But it kept getting worse. More hikers reported hearing the phantom train. Some said they saw lights moving through the tunnel at night, like train car windows lit up from inside. Others described feeling a cold wind when they walked through, even on hot days. A group of Boy Scouts camping nearby reported that the train crash sounds woke them up 3 nights in a row. Their scout leader called to complain that his kids couldn't sleep. Then on July 25th, something new happened. Lisa and I were doing an evening patrol, checking on campsites and making sure everyone was prepared for overnight storms. We were walking back to our truck around 7:30 p.m. when we saw 2 hikers running toward us from the direction of the tunnel. "There's someone trapped in there," the first hiker yelled. He was a college-aged kid, out of breath from running. We heard people calling for help. "How many people?" I asked. "Lots of them. Men, women, kids. They sound hurt real bad." One guy kept yelling for his wife. Lisa and I grabbed our emergency medical kits and ran toward the tunnel. If there were injured hikers inside, we needed to reach them fast. The tunnel was dark and quiet when we entered. We called out, our voices echoing in the darkness. "Hello. This is the Park Service. If anyone needs help, call out." Nothing. We walked deeper into the tunnel, stopping every 100 feet to listen and call out again. No response. No sign that anyone had been inside recently. We were almost to the far end when the sound started, but it wasn't 8 p.m. yet. It was only 7:45. People talking, a train whistle, the rumble of wheels getting closer. "Mike," Lisa said quietly, "look at your watch." It was 7:47 p.m. But the voices around us were getting clearer. I could make out individual conversations. A woman telling her husband about visiting their daughter in Harrisburg. A man reading newspaper headlines out loud. Children playing some kind of word game. The phantom train was early tonight. And the voices sounded more real than before. Lisa grabbed my arm. "Mike, look." I followed her gaze down the tunnel. In the distance, I could see a faint glow, like light coming from windows. The glow was getting brighter, moving toward us. The light was moving fast. I could see shapes now, the outline of a locomotive headlight, and behind it, rectangles of yellow light that looked like passenger car windows. But there was nothing on the tracks. The light was there, but no train. "Run," I said. We ran toward the tunnel entrance, but the phantom train was faster. The sounds got louder, wheels on tracks, steam engine chugging, people talking and laughing inside the cars. The light grew brighter behind us. I could feel wind now, even though nothing was moving. Cold air rushing past us as the invisible train approached. Then I heard something that made my blood freeze. "Help me," a woman's voice, clear and close. "Please, someone help me." I stopped running. "Lisa, did you hear that?" "Keep going," she yelled back. But the voice came again. "My little girl is trapped. Please help her." It was coming from right beside me. I turned my flashlight toward the sound, but nobody was there. More voices joined in, men calling for help, children crying. An old man saying, "I can't breathe, I can't breathe." These weren't echoes or acoustic anomalies. These were people in real distress, begging for help. The phantom train reached us. I felt something brush against me, like a person running past in panic. Then another. Cold touches, people moving around me in the darkness, but I couldn't see anyone. The woman's voice came again, right next to my ear. "Please don't leave us here. We've been waiting so long." Lisa had stopped running too. She was staring at something I couldn't see, her face white in the flashlight beam. "There's a little girl," she whispered. "Right there. She's hurt." I looked where Lisa was pointing. Nothing. But Lisa reached out like she was trying to touch someone. "It's okay, honey. We're here to help." The train sounds were all around us now. I could hear the brakes starting to scream. The horrible sound of metal grinding against metal. But under that noise, the voices were getting louder. Dozens of people calling for help. Describing their injuries, asking about family members, begging us not to leave them trapped in the dark tunnel. That's when I understood. They weren't trying to scare us. They were asking us to help them. The phantom train derailed right where we were standing. The crash sounds were deafening, but I forced myself to stay calm and listen to the voices. "My wife is under the seats," a man called out. "Please help her." "I can't move my legs," a woman sobbed. "Is my baby okay? Where's my baby?" "The smoke is so thick," an old man coughed. "I can't see anything. Is anyone there?" They were reliving the accident. Every night at 8 p.m., the same 18-minute train ride, followed by the same horrible crash. The same people dying over and over again, calling for help that never came. For 61 years, they'd been trapped in this tunnel, replaying their final moments. The voices started to fade as the phantom crash ended. But before they disappeared completely, the woman spoke to me one more time. "We just want someone to remember us, to know we were here." Then silence. Lisa and I stood in the empty tunnel for a long time, listening to our own breathing and the sound of bats moving overhead. "They're not trying to hurt anyone," I said finally. "They just want help." "Help with what?" "They're dead, Mike." "I know, but they don't seem to know that." We walked out of the tunnel as a summer thunderstorm started rolling in. Lightning flashed in the distance and thunder rumbled through the mountains. "We have to do something," Lisa said. "We can't just leave them like that." I agreed. But what could we do for people who died 61 years ago? The next morning, I drove to the county courthouse and looked up records about the train accident. I found the names of all 67 victims: men, women, children, people with families and jobs and dreams that ended in that tunnel. There was no memorial marker, no plaque or monument remembering what happened there. The railroad company had abandoned the site and tried to forget about it. When the state turned it into a hiking trail, they hadn't mentioned the accident in any of the trail guides or historical information. 67 people had died horrible deaths in that tunnel, and nobody remembered them. That afternoon, the thunderstorms hit hard. Lisa and I were stuck at the ranger station, monitoring weather reports and checking in with hikers who might need shelter. Around 4 p.m., we got an emergency call. 2 hikers were trapped in the tunnel by flash flooding. The storm had caused both creek crossings to overflow, cutting off their exit routes. "We have to go get them," I told Bill. "In this storm? The lightning risk is too high." But we couldn't leave people trapped in there overnight. Lisa and I put on our rain gear and drove up to the tunnel in the ranger truck. The storm was getting worse. Lightning strikes were hitting the mountainside every few minutes, and the wind was so strong it shook the truck. We ran into the tunnel calling for the trapped hikers. They answered from about halfway through. a young couple from New Jersey who had taken shelter when the storm started. "The water's too deep to cross," the man yelled. "We can't get out either direction." I checked my watch. It was 7:55 p.m. "We need to get them out of here fast," I told Lisa. But as we reached the hikers, the phantom train sounds started. The young couple looked around in panic. "What is that?" "Just acoustic anomalies," I lied. "Ignore it and stay close to us." But this time was different. The storm outside seemed to be affecting the phantom train. The sounds were louder and more chaotic. I could hear different voices, overlapping conversations, people arguing and panicking. The phantom crash came early and lasted longer than usual. The sounds of screaming and metal tearing apart echoed through the tunnel for what felt like hours. And in the middle of it all, I heard something new. My name, Michael. A woman's voice, calm and clear. "Michael Darkwood." I stopped walking. The voice came again. "We know who you are. You've been listening to us. You're the first person who understood." Lisa was helping the hikers toward the exit, but I stayed behind. The phantom voices were talking directly to me now. "Help us find peace," the woman said. "Tell them we were here. Tell them what happened to us." Lightning flashed outside, and for just a moment I could see them. Dozens of people in 1,920 seconds clothing, standing along the railroad tracks. Men in suits and hats, women in long dresses, children holding their parents' hands, all of them looking at me with desperate, pleading eyes. Then the lightning faded, and they were gone. "Mike," Lisa called from the tunnel entrance. "Come on." I ran toward her voice. The phantom train sounds fading behind me. The next week, I wrote a proposal to the State Park Service. I requested permission to install a memorial plaque at the Screaming Tunnel, honoring the 67 people who died in the 1926 train accident. I included all their names, ages, and hometowns. I described what happened that night in July 1926, and how their deaths had been forgotten when the railroad abandoned the tunnel. The state approved my request. On August 15, 1987, we held a memorial service at the tunnel entrance. Local newspapers had run stories about the anniversary of the accident, and about 50 people attended. Some were relatives of the original victims, grandchildren and great-grandchildren who had never known the details of how their family members died. Reverend Thomas Cole from the Pine Ridge Methodist Church led the service. He read each victim's name aloud and said a prayer for their souls. A local Boy Scout troop placed flowers by the new memorial plaque. That night, Lisa and I went back to check the tunnel. At 8 p.m., we heard the phantom train one last time. The whistle, the wheels on tracks, the voices of passengers. But something was different. The voices sounded peaceful now, people talking quietly, calmly. A few even sounded happy. When the 18 minutes ended, there was no crash. No screaming brakes or sounds of metal tearing apart. The train sounds just faded away gently, like a real train disappearing into the distance. We waited in the silence for 10 minutes. Then we heard something we'd never heard before. "Thank you." It was the woman's voice, but softer now. "At peace. Thank you for remembering us." That was the last time anyone reported strange sounds in the Screaming Tunnel. I stayed as a ranger on that section for 5 more years. Thousands of hikers passed through the tunnel during that time. Some stopped to read the memorial plaque and learned about what happened there in 1926. But nobody ever again reported hearing phantom trains or voices calling for help. The dead had found their peace. I transferred to a different section of the trail in 1992. I still hike through the Screaming Tunnel, sometimes when I'm in the area. It's just a normal abandoned railroad tunnel now. Hikers use it as a cool, shaded rest stop on hot days. Kids explore it with flashlights and tell each other scary stories. The memorial plaque is still there, weathered but readable. It lists all 67 names and tells the story of what happened on July 14, 1926. Sometimes I see people stopping to read it, paying their respects to strangers who died long before they were born. That's all the dead wanted, I think. Not to be forgotten. To have someone acknowledge that they were here, that their lives mattered, that their deaths meant something. I've been a ranger for 27 years now. I've seen mountain lions, black bears, and more injured hikers than I can count. I've been through blizzards, flash floods, and forest fires. But nothing has ever scared me as much as those voices in the tunnel, begging for help that came 61 years too late. And nothing has ever made me feel as good as the silence that followed, when they finally found peace. Sometimes, late at night, when I'm alone in the mountains, I think about all the other places where people died and were forgotten. All the accidents and tragedies that nobody remembers anymore. I wonder if there are other voices out there, still calling for help, still waiting for someone to listen. But that's a different story. This one ends with silence in the screaming tunnel, and 67 souls who can finally rest. My name is Elizabeth Grimshade, and I've been a ranger in the Daniel Boone National Forest for 23 years. In all that time, I thought I'd seen everything these Kentucky mountains could throw at me. I was wrong. People always ask why I became a ranger. The truth is, I started as an anthropology student back in college, fascinated by the ancient peoples who lived in these mountains thousands of years ago. The Adena culture left their mark all over this region. Burial mounds, sacred sites, tools and pottery that tell stories of lives lived long before European settlers ever saw these ridges. When I graduated, I couldn't afford graduate school, so I took a ranger job thinking it would be temporary. 23 years later, I'm still here, and I've made it my mission to protect every archaeological site in my territory. The government calls me a cultural resource protection specialist, which sounds fancy, but mostly means I chase off grave robbers and make sure construction crews don't bulldoze 1,000-year-old burial grounds. Devil's Backbone is the crown jewel of my territory, a narrow ridge that runs like a spine along the highest peaks, with limestone caves that have held Adena burials for over 2,000 years. Getting up there requires technical climbing gear and perfect weather. Most people never see it, which is exactly how I like it. The trouble started on December 15th, 1992. I was doing my winter survey, checking each site for damage from the recent storms. The snow was knee-deep, and I almost didn't make the climb, but something felt wrong. After 23 years in these mountains, you develop instincts about when places need checking. I reached Cave 7 around noon. It's one of the most important sites on the ridge, a natural limestone chamber where the Adena buried their most honored dead. The entrance is hidden behind a curtain of icicles in winter, making it nearly invisible unless you know exactly where to look. What I found inside made my breath catch in my throat. The burial goods had been rearranged. Now, I've cataloged every artifact in that cave at least 50 times. Stone tools, pottery fragments, shell beads, copper bracelets. I know their exact positions like a mother knows her children's faces, but someone had moved everything. Not stolen, moved. The artifacts were arranged in perfect geometric patterns across the cave floor, as if someone had been sorting them by age and importance. My first thought was looters, but that didn't make sense. Grave robbers take things. They don't rearrange them into museum-quality displays. Besides, the cave entrance showed no signs of recent entry. No broken icicles, no disturbed snow, no rope marks on the cliff face below. I photographed everything, then carefully restored the artifacts to their original positions. The patterns were beautiful in a way that made my skin crawl. Too perfect, too purposeful. Like someone had been organizing a collection. By the time I hiked back to my truck, the sun was setting behind the ridgeline, casting long shadows across the snow. I radioed my supervisor, Jake Morrison, and told him about the disturbance. Probably just settling, Jake said through the static. You know how freeze-thaw cycles can shift things around. But pottery doesn't arrange itself in perfect circles. Stone tools don't line themselves up by size. And in 23 years of winter surveys, I'd never seen anything like it. That night, I spread my photographs across my kitchen table and tried to make sense of what I'd seen. The patterns reminded me of something from my anthropology textbooks. The way museum curators arrange collections, or how archaeologists organize artifacts during cataloging. Professional, systematic, respectful, almost like someone was taking care of the dead. I should have left it alone, should have filed my report and moved on to the next site. But those patterns haunted my dreams, and when morning came, I found myself packing my climbing gear again. The mountains were waiting, silent and patient under their blanket of snow. Somewhere up on Devil's Backbone, in caves carved by water and time, The ancient dead were supposed to rest in peace. Instead, someone was playing with their belongings. And I intended to find out who. The climb back to Devil's Backbone took me 3 hours through knee-deep snow. I'd done this route hundreds of times, but something felt different. The forest was too quiet. No bird calls, no squirrel chatter, just the crunch of my boots and the whisper of wind through bare branches. I reached Cave 7 by mid-morning and found my worst fears confirmed. The artifacts had been rearranged again. This time, the pattern was even more elaborate. Every pottery shard, every stone tool, every piece of worked copper had been sorted into concentric circles around the cave's central burial platform. The arrangement was so precise it looked like a textbook illustration of Adena burial practices. But that wasn't the strangest part. New artifacts had appeared. 3 copper bracelets that weren't in any of my catalogs lay at the center of the display. They were clearly Adena work. The green patina and craftsmanship were unmistakable, but I'd never seen them before. According to my records, every artifact in this cave had been documented for decades. I knelt beside the bracelets, my breath forming clouds in the cold air. They were beautiful pieces, intricate spirals that would have taken skilled craftsmen weeks to create. But how had they gotten here? The cave entrance remained undisturbed. The snow outside showed only my own tracks from yesterday. A sound from deeper in the cave made me freeze. Click, 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 like stones tapping against each other. Or bones. I grabbed my flashlight and aimed it toward the sound. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing the cave's back chamber. Nothing moved in the yellow circle of light, but the clicking continued, rhythmic, purposeful, like someone working with small objects. "Hello?" My voice echoed off the limestone walls. "Forest Service, who's in there?" The clicking stopped. Silence stretched for long seconds, broken only by my own rapid breathing. Then, from the darkness beyond my flashlight beam, came a whisper of movement. Not footsteps, something else, like fabric brushing against stone, or dried leaves stirring in a breeze that shouldn't exist underground. I should have left then. Every instinct screamed at me to back away, climb down the ridge, and call for backup. Instead, I stepped deeper into the cave. The beam of my flashlight swept across the back chamber, revealing more burial platforms carved into the living rock. Ancient bones lay on each platform, wrapped in the remains of burial shrouds that had somehow survived 2,000 years in the dry cave air. But one of the platforms was empty. The clicking sound resumed. Closer now. I spun toward it, my light catching movement in my peripheral vision. Something pale ducked behind a stone formation just at the edge of my beam. "I know you're there," I said, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. "I'm not here to take anything. I'm trying to protect this place." A new sound answered me, a low humming, like someone singing under their breath. The melody was haunting, unlike anything I'd heard before. It seemed to come from all around me, echoing off the cave walls in harmonies that made the hair on my arm stand up. I followed the sound deeper into the chamber, my flashlight beam dancing across ancient stone carvings. The Adena had decorated these walls with symbols that anthropologists still didn't fully understand. Spirals and circles, representations of the journey between life and death. The humming grew louder, and I realized it wasn't one voice, but many, layering together in a complex harmony that seemed to vibrate through the stone itself. The sound was beautiful and terrible, like a lullaby sung for the dead. My light found the source of the clicking. On the far platform, bones were moving. Not decomposing bones. These were ancient, clean, the color of old ivory. But they were arranging themselves, finger bones sorting through small objects with impossible delicacy. As I watched in fascination and growing terror, skeletal hands placed copper beads in careful patterns, organized stone tools by size and function. The skeleton was incomplete, missing its skull, several ribs, one entire arm. But what remained worked with infinite patience, treating each artifact like a precious treasure. When it noticed my flashlight beam, it paused, finger bones still gripping a small pottery fragment. We stared at each other across 2,000 years of death. The humming stopped abruptly, and in the sudden silence, I could hear my own heart pounding. The skeleton tilted its incomplete torso toward me, and although it had no eyes, I felt the weight of its attention, like a physical presence. When it resumed its work, I understood that I was witnessing something beyond my comprehension. This wasn't grave robbing or vandalism. It was maintenance. Care. Someone, something, was taking care of the dead. I backed slowly toward the cave entrance, keeping my light trained on the working skeleton. It ignored me, focused entirely on its meticulous arrangement of burial goods. Only when I reached the main chamber did I turn and run. The climb down Devil's Backbone passed in a blur of adrenaline and disbelief. By the time I reached my truck, my hands were shaking so hard I could barely grip the radio. "Jake," I gasped when my supervisor answered. "We need to talk, in person, right now." "Liz, you sound like you've seen a ghost." I looked back up at Devil's Backbone, where ancient caves held secrets I was only beginning to understand. "Something like that," I whispered. Jake Morrison met me at the ranger station that evening, bringing coffee and the skeptical expression he wore whenever I got too interested in the archaeological sites. But his skepticism faded as I described what I'd seen in Cave 7. "Moving bones," he said slowly, setting down his coffee cup. "Liz, when's the last time you took vacation time?" "This isn't stress, Jake. Something is protecting those burial sites." I spread my photographs across the desk between us. "Look at these arrangements. This isn't random disturbance. It's systematic organization." Jake studied the pictures, his frown deepening. "Even if I believed you, and I'm not saying I do, what are you suggesting we do about it?" Before I could answer, the radio crackled to life. "Base, this is Unit 7. We've got a possible break-in at the University Archaeology Lab. Professor requesting ranger assistance." Jake grabbed the radio. "Unit 7, this is Base. What's the nature of the break-in?" "Weird one, Base. Nothing stolen, but artifacts have been rearranged. Professor says someone sorted through 30 years of Devil's Backbone collections overnight." Jake and I stared at each other across the desk. The university lab was 15 miles from Devil's Backbone, locked behind multiple security doors. "We're on our way," Jake said into the radio. Professor Sarah Whitehawk met us at the University Archaeology Lab looking like she hadn't slept. She was a Cherokee woman in her 50s who'd been studying Adena culture longer than I'd been a ranger. Her usually neat office looked like a tornado had hit it, except the chaos was completely organized. "They sorted everything," she said, leading us through rows of artifact tables. Pottery with pottery, tools with tools, ceremonial items with ceremonial items. 30 years of collections, organized by age and cultural significance. The lab contained hundreds of artifacts from Devil's Backbone caves, legally excavated pieces that Professor Whitehawk used for her research. Now they were arranged in the same geometric patterns I'd found in Cave 7. "When did you notice this?" I asked, photographing the arrangements. "This morning. I locked up last night at 6 p.m., everything normal. Came in at 7 a.m. to find this." She gestured helplessly at the organized chaos. "Security cameras show nothing. Motion detectors never triggered. But someone spent hours in here, treating our collections like a museum display." Jake examined the security door. "No signs of forced entry. Inside job?" "I have the only key," Professor Whitehawk said. "And my graduate students are all home for winter break except Kevin Ravenhart. He's working on his thesis about Adena burial practices." "Where's Kevin now?" I asked. "Should be at the field camp. He's doing his final survey of Cave 12 before winter shuts down access." My blood went cold. Cave 12 was the most remote site on Devil's Backbone, accessible only by rappelling down a 40-foot cliff face. If something was moving between the caves and the lab, Kevin was alone up there with whatever I'd seen, sorting bones in the darkness. "We need to get to him," I said. Now. The climb to Cave 12 took us 4 hours through worsening weather. Jake grumbled about wild goose chases, but he came anyway. 20 years of partnership had taught him to trust my instincts about these mountains. We found Kevin's gear at the rappel point. His ropes were still anchored, disappearing over the cliff edge into the gathering dusk. But when we called down to him, only silence answered. "Kevin," my voice echoed off the limestone walls. "Kevin Ravenhart." Jake tested the ropes, then started his descent. "I'm going down. Radio if anything happens up here." I watched his headlamp disappear into the darkness, counting seconds that stretched into minutes. When his voice finally crackled through the radio, I could hear the tension in it. "Liz, you need to see this." The rappel down to Cave 12 was treacherous in the fading light, but I made it without incident. Jake met me at the cave entrance, his face pale in the glow of our headlamps. "He's in there," Jake said quietly. "But Liz..." Something's wrong. Cave 12 was smaller than Cave 7, but equally sacred to the Adena people. Kevin Ravenheart sat cross-legged in the center of the chamber, surrounded by perfectly arranged artifacts. His eyes were open, staring at something I couldn't see, and he was humming the same haunting melody I'd heard in Cave 7. Kevin? I approached slowly, keeping my voice gentle. It's Ranger Grimshade. Can you hear me? He didn't respond. The humming continued, that complex harmony that seemed to come from multiple voices. But Kevin was alone. Jake knelt beside the young man, checking for injuries. No wounds. Pulse is steady. But look at his hands. Kevin's fingers were stained with something dark that looked like old blood. Around him, artifacts were arranged in the same geometric patterns we'd found everywhere else. But these weren't random pieces. They were items that belonged in Cave 7, 15 miles away. How did these get here? Jake whispered. Before I could answer, the humming grew louder. Not from Kevin, from the darkness at the back of the cave. Multiple voices joining in ancient harmony, welcoming the dead. And in that moment, I realized Kevin Ravenheart wasn't sitting with the artifacts. He was becoming one of them. The temperature in the cave dropped 20 degrees in seconds. Our breath turned to clouds, and frost began forming on the limestone walls. From the darkness came the clicking sound I'd learned to fear, bones moving with purpose. We need to get him out of here, I said, reaching for Kevin's arm. The moment I touched him, his eyes snapped to mine. They were completely black, like looking into an empty well. When he spoke, his voice carried echoes that shouldn't exist. The collectors are coming home, he said in a voice that wasn't quite his own. They're taking back what was stolen. Jake grabbed Kevin's other arm, and together we tried to lift him. But the young man was impossibly heavy, as if the cave itself was holding him down. The humming grew louder, and shapes began moving in our peripheral vision. Pale forms that scattered when we turned our lights toward them. Leave him, a new voice said from the darkness. Ancient, patient, speaking English with an accent that predated the language itself. He has chosen to stay, to help us gather what belongs with the dead. I aimed my flashlight toward the voice and found myself face to face with something that had once been human. The skeleton was more complete than the one in Cave 7. A full skull, most of its bones intact, decorated with copper ornaments and shell beads. It stood 8 feet tall, impossible and beautiful, and utterly terrifying. We are the bone collectors, it continued, stepping into the light without fear. We gather the scattered children, return the stolen memories. Your student understands now. He helps us remember. Kevin's humming grew louder, and I realized he wasn't trapped, he was participating. Whatever these entities were, they had offered him something he wanted more than his own life. Jake pulled harder on Kevin's arm. Like hell, nobody gets left behind. The bone collector tilted its ancient skull, studying Jake with empty sockets that somehow conveyed amusement. You may try, living one, but the mountains have many caves, and winter nights are long. We have patience that spans millennia. More shapes emerged from the darkness, dozens of them, skeletal figures carrying artifacts in their bone hands. Some wore the remains of ancient burial shrouds, others gleamed naked in the flashlight beam. All moved with the same careful purpose I'd witnessed in Cave 7. They were collecting their dead. And Kevin Ravenheart, brilliant graduate student who'd spent 3 years studying Adena burial practices, had volunteered to help them. The bone collectors formed a circle around us, their ancient forms moving with liquid grace in the flashlight beams. Each carried artifacts, pottery, tools, ornaments that belonged in caves scattered across Devil's Backbone. They weren't stealing, they were returning things to where they belonged. You don't understand, I said to the tallest skeleton, the one who seemed to be their leader. We're not here to take anything. I've spent 23 years protecting these sites. The bone collector tilted its skull, empty sockets somehow conveying consideration. Elizabeth Grimshade. Yes, we know you. The guardian who walks between worlds, keeping the sacred places safe. Its voice carried the whisper of wind through empty bones. But protection and understanding are different gifts. Kevin's humming stopped abruptly, and he turned those black eyes toward me. When he spoke, his voice layered with harmonies that shouldn't exist in a human throat. They showed me the truth, Ranger Grimshade. For 200 years, people have been taking from these caves, stealing our ancestors' belongings, selling them to collectors who don't understand their meaning. The dead have been scattered, incomplete, unable to rest. Jake kept his grip on Kevin's arm, but I could see the doubt creeping into his expression. What are you saying, kid? I'm saying we've been thinking about this all wrong, Kevin replied, his borrowed voice gaining strength. We treat these artifacts like museum pieces, but they're not. They're part of the people buried here. Taking them away is like cutting off pieces of the dead. The lead bone collector stepped closer, and I caught the scent of earth and time, the smell of things buried deep and patient. Your student learns quickly. He sees what academics miss, that death is not ending, but transformation. These caves are not tombs, but transition spaces. Around us, the other collectors continued their work, sorting through artifacts with infinite care. I watched skeletal hands place a copper bracelet on a burial platform, adjust the position of a stone knife, arrange shell beads in patterns that hurt to look at directly. What do you want from us? I asked. Partnership, the collector replied. Your people have laws that protect these places, but laws mean nothing to those who steal in darkness. We offer enforcement that transcends human authority. Jake laughed nervously. You want us to work with ghosts? Not ghosts, Kevin corrected, his dark eyes reflecting our flashlight beams. Guardians. They've been here since the first burial, watching, waiting, keeping the sacred places intact. But modern thieves have tools the ancient dead cannot match. Vehicles to carry away heavy objects, knowledge of which artifacts bring the highest prices. The bone collector nodded slowly. Technology changes, but greed remains constant. We need allies who understand both worlds, the sacred and the bureaucratic. I thought about my 23 years of fighting an endless war against grave robbers. How many times had I found sites stripped clean, ancient burial goods scattered to private collectors and black market dealers? How many reports had I filed that resulted in nothing but paperwork? What kind of partnership? I asked. The collector gestured to the circle of skeletal figures around us. We continue our work, gathering the scattered dead, returning stolen goods to their proper places. You provide legitimacy, official protection that keeps the curious away while we restore what has been lost. And Kevin? The young man smiled, and for a moment, his eyes cleared, showing me the brilliant student I'd known. I chose this, Ranger Grimshade. They offered me something no university ever could. The chance to actually protect these sites instead of just studying them. Jake's grip tightened on Kevin's arm. This is insane. Liz, we can't seriously be considering. His words were cut off by a sound from outside the cave. Engines, multiple vehicles climbing the mountain roads. The bone collectors turned as one toward the entrance, their skeletal forms radiating sudden tension. Looters, the lead collector hissed. They come for the winter artifacts while the sites are unguarded. I recognized the sound too. The same pattern of engines I'd heard during previous raids, when organized thieves came equipped with climbing gear and metal detectors. They'd hit 3 sites last winter, stripping them clean before I could respond. How many? I asked, already reaching for my radio. Kevin closed his eyes, and when he opened them again, they were solid black. 8 humans. Professional equipment. They know exactly which caves to target. The bone collectors began moving toward the cave entrance, with purpose that made my spine crawl. These weren't mindless revenants. They were intelligent, organized, and about to protect their territory in ways human law enforcement couldn't match. Wait, I called after them. If you kill those people, it'll bring investigations, media attention. Everything you're trying to protect will be exposed. The lead collector paused at the cave mouth. Then what do you propose? Guardian? Jake was already on his radio, calling for backup that wouldn't arrive for hours. But I had a different idea. One that might save the looters' lives while giving the bone collectors what they wanted. Let me try something first, I said, pulling out my own radio. This is Ranger Grimshade calling all units. We have confirmed grave robbing in progress at Devil's Backbone. Multiple suspects with professional equipment. Request immediate support from State Police and FBI Cultural Crimes Unit. I looked up at the bone collector. Can you make their vehicles not work? Nothing permanent, just temporarily disabled? The skeletal figure tilted its head, considering. You wish us to trap them for your human authorities? I wish you to help me prove that sometimes the old ways and new ways can work together. The bone collector was silent for a long moment, empty sockets, somehow conveying deep thought. Then it turned to the others and made a gesture I didn't understand. The circle of skeletal figures flowed out of the cave like smoke, disappearing into the darkness beyond our lights. "Kevin," I said urgently, "can you control this connection? Can you come back to us?" The young man struggled visibly, black eyes flickering between human and otherworldly. I can try. But Ranger Grimshade, they're not evil. They're just trying to protect something sacred that we've been treating like a commodity." Jake helped Kevin to his feet, supporting him as the artificial weight seemed to leave his body. "Let's worry about philosophy later, kid. Right now, we need to get you medical attention." But Kevin shook his head, his eyes clearing further. "No, you need to see this work. If the bone collectors can help us catch these thieves in the act, it proves they're not the enemy. They're allies we've been too blind to recognize." From outside the cave came the sound of vehicles dying one by one, followed by confused shouting. The bone collectors were keeping their part of the bargain. Now it was up to me to keep mine. I keyed my radio again. "All units, suspects are experiencing vehicle trouble. They're stranded at the scene with stolen artifacts. This is our chance to get them all." In the growing darkness of Devil's Backbone, ancient guardians and modern law enforcement were about to work together for the first time in 2,000 years. The arrest went down like something from a law enforcement training video. By the time state police and FBI agents climbed Devil's Backbone, they found 8 professional grave robbers standing beside their disabled vehicles, surrounded by stolen artifacts they couldn't explain and equipment that had mysteriously stopped functioning. The thieves' leader, a man named Carver, who'd been hitting archaeological sites across 3 states, kept insisting that something in the darkness had sabotaged their operation. The investigators wrote it off as stress from being caught red-handed. Kevin Ravenheart spent 2 days in the hospital under observation for hypothermia and exhaustion. The doctors found nothing wrong with him except dehydration and mild frostbite. He returned to his thesis work the following week, but his research focus had shifted. Instead of studying Adena burial practices, he was documenting the cultural significance of leaving certain places undisturbed. Jake never asked me directly about what we'd seen in Cave 12, but I caught him reading reports about unexplained archaeological site preservation in other national forests. Apparently, we weren't the only rangers dealing with mysterious protection of ancient burial grounds. 3 weeks after the arrests, I climbed back to Cave 7 for my regular winter survey. The artifacts were arranged in their traditional positions, exactly as they had been for centuries, but new items had appeared. Pieces that matched descriptions from old theft reports going back decades. The bone collectors were keeping their word, returning stolen goods from private collections and black market dealers. How they accomplished this, I chose not to ask. I left an offering that day, tobacco and cornmeal, wrapped in cloth as Professor Whitehawk had taught me. When I returned the next week, the offering was gone, replaced by a single eagle feather placed carefully on the central burial platform. The partnership was working. Over the following months, grave robbing incidents in the Daniel Boone National Forest dropped to 0. Word spread through the looter networks that Devil's Backbone had become unlucky. Equipment failures, vehicles that wouldn't start, crews that returned from midnight raids with missing time and empty hands. I filed my reports carefully, documenting the improved site security while avoiding any mention of supernatural assistance. The official record showed that increased ranger patrols and better coordination with law enforcement had eliminated the theft problem. Kevin Ravenheart completed his thesis that spring. His advisor, Professor Whitehawk, praised it as groundbreaking work on the importance of cultural site preservation. Kevin accepted a position with the Cherokee Nation's Cultural Resources Department, where his unique understanding of protective guardianship would serve ancient sites across the region. The bone collectors still work the caves of Devil's Backbone, maintaining their eternal watch over the dead. Sometimes, during winter surveys, I glimpse pale figures in my peripheral vision, sorting through artifacts with infinite patience. We nod to each other across the centuries, guardians separated by time but united in purpose. Last month, a developer submitted plans to build a resort on land adjacent to Devil's Backbone. The proposal included spa facilities, luxury cabins, and guided tours of authentic Native American burial caves. The planning committee approved the project unanimously. 2 days later, every member of that committee woke to find their vehicles filled with ancient pottery shards, their offices decorated with careful arrangements of bone fragments, and their phones ringing with calls from FBI cultural crimes investigators. The resort proposal was withdrawn that afternoon. My name is Elizabeth Grimshade, and I've been protecting these mountains for 24 years now. I've learned that some partnerships transcend the boundaries between life and death, that respect can bridge gaps of thousands of years, and that the best way to honor the past is to let it defend itself. The bone collectors of Devil's Backbone are still working, still gathering their scattered children home, and I'm still here, making sure they have the space and time to complete their sacred task. Some places don't need human protection. They need human understanding. And sometimes, late at night when the wind howls through the caves and the ancient dead sing their harmonies to the stars, I think I'm finally beginning to understand what that means. The mountains remember everything, and now, so do I.